Hey guys, quick question for you. Have you ever fantasized about having a job where everyone either hates you, fears you, or actively tries to vomit on your shoes? A job so misunderstood, so reviled, that entire taverns go silent the moment you walk in? Well, congratulations. You'd make a perfect medieval executioner. Today, we're going to take a gloriously grim dive into what it was actually like to be the person swinging the axe, tightening the noose, or inventively setting people on fire for the entertainment of an extremely disturbed crowd. Spoiler alert, it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cool, and if you're hoping for a satisfying character arc where our executioner finds inner peace, you're in the wrong century. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. So picture it, it's the 13th century and you're an unlucky bastard. Maybe you got caught stealing. Maybe you were just the wrong guy standing in the wrong place when the sheriff was looking for volunteers. Or perhaps, and this is honestly most likely, your father was an executioner and now you are too. Because being a medieval executioner wasn't a job you applied for, it was a curse you inherited. Like male pattern baldness or a family recipe for soup that's just water and sadness. The executioner existed in a bizarre, paradoxical space. On one hand, you were absolutely essential to the justice system. You were the living embodiment of law and order, a professional boogeyman reminding everyone else to keep their hands off the church collection plate. On the other hand, you were about as socially popular as the plague. People despised you, not because you were cruel, though let's be honest, some of them probably were, but because they believed you were spiritually contaminated. Touching an executioner could bring bad luck. Sitting where an executioner had sat could curse your entire family line with boils, miscarriages, and chronic halitosis. You didn't get to live inside the city walls like respectable folk. No. You lived outside, on the edge of town, usually in some mud-caked shack near the gallows or the execution grounds. Which was convenient, really, since your commute to work was about 30 paces, and your coworkers were a collection of rats, stray dogs, and the occasional drunk who passed out in a ditch and woke up covered in flies. Now, let's talk about the job itself. You might think the executioner just showed up on beheading day, swung an axe, and called it a shift. Oh no, you were responsible for a wide array of delightful duties, including but not limited to administering torture to extract confessions, because nothing says reliable testimony like someone agreeing to murder their own grandmother after a few turns on, the rack, branding thieves with red-hot irons, chopping off various limbs for assorted crimes, and disposing of rotting corpses that no one else wanted to touch. You were basically a one-man human resources department for medieval suffering. And get this, you didn't get paid by the hour. Oh no, that would have made too much sense. You were usually compensated per execution or per service, which meant on slow weeks, you had to get creative. Some executioners supplemented their income by acting as unofficial veterinarians, pulling teeth or brewing love potions made from God knows what. I mean, what else are you gonna do with a bag of severed ears? Waste not, want not. Your equipment was your livelihood, and it was a mixed bag of horrors. The axe was your mainstay, of course, though not every town could afford a proper executioner's sword. Those were fancy, reserved for rich places like Nuremberg or Paris. You might also use a broad knife, a rope for hangings, a wheel for breaking limbs, or a collection of tongs and pincers for enthusiastic interrogations. If you were particularly enterprising, you might invent your own devices, because medieval Europe had a disturbingly entrepreneurial spirit when it came to pain. But the axe. Let's spend a moment on the axe. Contrary to what you've seen in movies, most medieval axes weren't gleaming, pristine instruments of death. They were clunky, blunt, often splintering chunks of wood flying with every swing. Keeping it sharp was your personal responsibility, and there were executioners who took pride in having a clean, one-stroke beheading. Others didn't, which led to public spectacles where a single execution could turn into a 10-minute butchering session as the crowd hurled insults and cabbages and the condemned turned from human to very angry pincushion. Oh yes, the crowd, because no matter how grim or gruesome the sentence, it wasn't considered a real execution unless half the town turned up with picnic baskets, People brought their kids, their dogs, their in-laws. Street vendors sold wine, pies, and bits of trinkets supposedly made from the hair of hanged men. There was a festive atmosphere to it, a kind of open-air horror festival where you could bond with your neighbors over a good old-fashioned disembowelment, and you, the star of the show, were both indispensable and loathed. You might receive a free drink afterward, but it was just as likely someone would throw a stone at your head while you weren't looking. Or worse, avoid eye contact, which in the medieval social hierarchy was tantamount to declaring you beneath the rats. Let's not forget the physical hazards of the job. Executing people is dangerous work. Heads don't always come off cleanly. Ropes snap, wheels break, panicking prisoners try to bolt for freedom. There's blood, bone splinters, bodily fluids you didn't know existed, and the ever-present threat of catching whatever disease the condemned might be carrying. Remember, this is a time when medical advice was essentially rub it with garlic and pray. If you accidentally cut yourself while hacking off a criminal's arm, you might wake up 3 days later with a fever, some mystery pustules, and the realization that you now have about a week to get your affairs in order. But the real joy, the spiritual highlight of your profession, was the execution of high-profile criminals, nobles, rebels, witches, heretics. These weren't just jobs, these were events. You might be ordered to invent a particularly dramatic death, burning at the stake, classic, drawing and quartering, always a crowd pleaser, drowning in a barrel of boiling wine, surprisingly popular in certain regions of France. And if you messed it up, if you botched the timing, if the rope broke, if the flames sputtered out too soon, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was blasphemous. The crowd could turn ugly fast. There are recorded instances of executioners being lynched by mobs for not killing a heretic fast enough. It was a tough gig, and then there were the complications. For example, did you know executioners weren't allowed to enter churches? The medieval church believed you carried spiritual contamination from the deaths you dealt. No last rites, no holy water, no confession. You were, in every sense, a walking corpse with a heartbeat. Marriage prospects? Don't make me laugh. Even prostitutes sometimes refused your business, and considering this is an era where people bathed once a year, that's saying something. Social isolation was the constant companion of the medieval executioner. Some towns forbade them from participating in markets, sitting on council benches, or even owning property. They were sometimes forced to wear distinctive clothing so people could avoid them in the street. Imagine a scarlet letter situation, but with more pustules. Their children were often marked by association, growing up pariahs and inheriting the family trade whether they liked it or not. Yet despite all this, executioners were, paradoxically, respected for their skill. A clean, swift beheading was admired, a rope that broke a neck on the first drop, rather than strangling a man for 20 agonizing minutes, earned grudging applause. Some executioners even became minor celebrities known for their flair, their technique, or their particularly sadistic innovations. A few were invited to other towns to oversee tricky executions, traveling from city to city like grotesque consultants. But don't get too romantic about it. For every famous executioner with a name remembered by history, there were 1,000 anonymous mud-smeared butchers who lived short, miserable lives filled with disease, violence, and unrelenting dread. And the kicker? Many medieval executioners believed they were damned, not in a fun, rebellious way, but in the eternal, flames of hell, no get-out-of-jail-free card kind of way. They did the job because someone had to, but they knew it cost them their soul. Some kept elaborate journals cataloging each death, hoping perhaps to bargain with God on Judgment Day. Others drank themselves into oblivion. A few abandoned the job and fled into the wilderness, though good luck surviving there without a clean reputation. And still, the axe had to fall, the rope had to tighten, the wheel had to turn, because if no one did it, society would unravel, and medieval townsfolk, much like modern internet comment sections, were always hungry for blood. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've either got an iron stomach or a morbid curiosity streak wide enough to drive a plague car through. Either way, welcome back to the miserable, blood-stained, socially toxic world of the medieval executioner. If you thought part 1 was bleak, buckle up, because now we're going to get into the daily grind of medieval justice and just how creatively horrifying your workload could get. Let's start with interrogation, or as medieval lawmen like to call it, persuasion. Because apparently, tying someone to a rack and stretching them until their joints popped like wet firewood counts as a gentle conversation in the 14th century. As an executioner, you were the designated torture technician. Not because you were particularly skilled, but because no one else wanted to do it, and since you were already contaminated, what was one more sin on the pile? And let's be very clear, medieval interrogation techniques were the fever dream of a sadist with access to a blacksmith and zero moral compass. The rack was a classic, a simple wooden frame with rollers at each end and ropes attached to your victim's wrists and ankles. You'd crank the rollers, slowly pulling the prisoner's body apart like a chicken being prepped for stew. Tendons snapped, shoulders dislocated, occasionally a leg would pop clean off, which was messy, but hey, occupational hazard. Then there was the strappado, a charming little setup where the accused had their hands tied behind their back, were hoisted into the air by a rope, then suddenly dropped, stopping inches before the ground. The sudden jolt dislocated both shoulders, and if the victim didn't confess after the first drop, you did it again, and again, and again. Who needs evidence when you've got gravity and spite? Another favorite was the thumbscrew, a deceptively simple device designed to crush the fingers or toes between two metal bars. Medieval inventiveness being what it was, some versions came with spikes. Others could hold entire hands or feet. And then there was water torture, not the CIA-approved kind. This was medieval Europe, so they went for forced ingestion, stuffing a funnel down a victim's throat and pouring gallons of water until their stomach distended like an overinflated wineskin. If the person didn't drown, they'd wish they had. Now you might be thinking, surely there were rules, right? Some kind of limit? Oh, sweet summer child. The only rule was that a confession extracted under torture had to be repeated voluntarily afterward, usually after a night in the dungeon and a polite reminder that the thumbscrews were still available if they wanted to change their mind. And guess who got to conduct that second session? Yep, you again. On execution days, you had to prep the site yourself. No assistants, no municipal sanitation team. You dragged out the gallows, sharpened your blades, tested the rope, and cleared out whatever decomposing remains the crows hadn't finished from the last hanging. Execution grounds stank, not just of blood, but of fear, old sweat, and the kind of rot that seeps into your clothes and stays there no matter how many times you wash them in the river. And speaking of rivers, if your town executed people by drowning, you had to be the one to tie the condemned in a sack, add a rock or two, and toss them into the nearest body of water. If you were lucky, they'd sink quickly. If not, they'd thrash around for several horrifying minutes while the crowd jeered and placed bets. Fun for the whole family. Beheadings were a big deal, especially for nobles. You had to look the part, sometimes wearing a black hood. Not for anonymity, mind you, everyone still knew exactly who you were, but because it added drama. The axe had to be freshly sharpened. The executioner's sword, if available, was even better. Longer, cleaner, more expensive. Only cities with decent budgets could afford those. You could tell how rich a town was by the size of its execution sword, and believe it or not, the condemned sometimes tipped you for a clean job, especially nobles. It wasn't uncommon for a doomed aristocrat to slip the executioner a pouch of coins with instructions like, "Make it quick," or "Don't embarrass me in front of the Duke." And God help you if you botched it. There are records, gruesome, glorious records, of executions gone horribly wrong. One 16th century German executioner named Franz Schmidt kept a diary where he admitted to needing 7 blows to sever a head once. 7. By the 5th swing, the crowd's probably halfway through their lunch, the condemned is making sounds like a broken accordion, and you're internally drafting your apology to the local magistrate. Hanging wasn't as simple as tying a noose and giving the condemned a hearty push. The rope length had to be calculated precisely. Too short, and the person strangled slowly, which was considered cruel and inefficient. Too long, and the head could pop clean off, which, while undeniably entertaining, made cleanup a nightmare. Experienced executioners knew how to gauge the prisoner's weight, the rope's elasticity, and the weather conditions. Yes, weather. Wet ropes stretched, cold air stiffened neck muscles. These were the considerations you lived with, and people say medieval professions lacked nuance. Then there were the burnings, reserved for witches, heretics, and sometimes adulterers. Burning at the stake was as much a public spectacle as an execution. You had to build the pyre yourself, stack the wood, douse it with oil if the town could spare any, tie the prisoner to the stake, and then light it while the town priest recited a sermon about divine justice. Fun fact, death by fire isn't instant. Most victims died of smoke inhalation long before the flames reached them, but not always. The real horror was for those unfortunate souls where the wind kept shifting, prolonging the agony. And you? You had to stand there, making sure no one tried to sneak in and rescue the condemned mid-blaze, because yes, that actually happens sometimes. And let's talk about quartering. If your town got the nod to execute a particularly notorious criminal by being drawn and quartered, congratulations. You were about to have the worst workday of your life. The process involved tying each of the condemned's limbs to a different horse and then goading them in opposite directions. But here's the logistical issue. Medieval horses weren't trained for synchronized dismemberment. Sometimes one horse bolted too early, or another refused to move, leaving you with a half-pulled torso flopping around like a gruesome marionette. It could take hours. In some cases, you'd have to step in with a knife to finish the job yourself. And yes, there were still people in the audience casually eating roasted chestnuts while this happened. If the criminal was of high enough profile, parts of the body might be displayed afterward. A head on a spike at the city gate, a hand nailed to the gallows, legs strung up like grotesque party streamers. Guess who got to transport those body parts and nail them up? You. Bonus hazard, the crows were vicious. Now, you might wonder what sort of person did this job for more than a week without losing their mind. The answer is, people who had no other choice. Many executioners were sons of executioners, trapped in a hereditary profession no one else would touch. Others were criminals themselves, given a pardon in exchange for taking up the role. A few were war veterans with too many missing teeth and not enough prospects, and for all the blood and horror, the pay was usually terrible. Executioners earned money per job, which meant no executions, no income. Some towns gave you a stipend of bread, ale, and a place to live, which was typically a hovel on the edge of a swamp, but it barely covered the basics. That's why many executioners doubled as local butchers, animal skinners, and unofficial enforcers. If the local lord needed someone to beat information out of a tavern keeper or run a debtor out of town, guess who got the call? As for your personal life, assuming you were foolish enough to attempt one, options were limited. Marrying outside your profession was almost impossible. Few families wanted to be related to the town head chopper. Marrying another executioner's daughter was common, but not exactly the stuff of courtly romance. Children born to executioners often inherited the job, doomed from birth to a life of gore and isolation. Some towns forced them to live in designated executioner villages, entire hamlets filled with pariahs, like a medieval version of the world's most depressing gated community. And what happened when you got too old or too injured to swing an axe? Retirement plans were not exactly robust. If you were lucky, you kept your position as a torturer, where your failing eyesight and arthritis didn't matter quite as much. If not, you begged, or drank yourself to death, or, in a particularly cruel irony, found yourself on the wrong side of the axe. More than one executioner was executed for crimes like theft, assault, or hilariously, botching an execution. By now, you're probably wondering, was there any upside? Well, a few. Executioners occasionally received bribes to make an execution mercifully swift or delay it for a final confession. Some accumulated enough wealth to buy land or hire apprentices. A very small handful became local celebrities, famous for their precision or brutality, depending on the town's mood. Franz Schmidt, for example, was known for keeping detailed records of his executions and died respected, albeit still cursed by the church. But for most, it was a life of blood, isolation, and constant reminders of humanity's bottomless appetite for suffering. And through it all, you did what you had to, because someone always had to be the one to pull the lever, drop the blade, light the fire. Someone had to stand ankle-deep in gore while the townsfolk cheered. And if you refused, well, there was always a fresh noose waiting for cowards. By now, you might be wondering how medieval executioners coped. How do you go home after a long day of axe swinging, thumb crushing, and limb severing and just relax? Well, the short answer is, you didn't. Because relaxation is for people with options, and medieval executioners had about as many life choices as a condemned pig on slaughter day, which is to say, none. Let's talk about the aftercare of your victims. Because yes, even in medieval Europe, corpses didn't clean themselves up. Once the execution was done, the cheering died down, and the townsfolk wandered off to get drunk or curse the local tax collector. It was your job to deal with the grisly remains. That meant retrieving severed heads from the straw, dragging limp corpses off the scaffold, and deciding whether they were destined for a shallow grave, a spiked post, or to be boiled in pitch for public display. Boiling heads in pitch, by the way, was a medieval pastime you don't hear enough about. See, if you just stuck a head on a pike, it would rot in the sun and stink up the city within days. Boiling it in tar not only preserved it, turning it a glossy, grotesque black, but made it a warning that could last for months, maybe even years if the weather was nice. The birds would still peck out the eyes, of course. Nothing medieval medicine could do about that. Unless you think you had a team of merry assistants helping you, let me crush that dream right now. Most executioners worked alone. The idea of an apprentice executioner was mostly theoretical. Towns didn't want to pay for extra hands, and besides, no one wanted the job. Occasionally, a teenage son or a desperate orphan might be dragged into service, but turnover rates were high. Few people stuck around after the first time a decapitated head winked at them from the basket. Then there was the business of executions at a distance. You see, not every criminal was conveniently located. Sometimes you had to travel, which, in medieval Europe, was less leisurely road trip and more grueling death march, where bandits, wolves, and dysentery all took turns trying to kill you. If the local lord sentenced a heretic 3 villages over, you loaded your tools: axe, ropes, branding irons, perhaps a small barrel of pitch, and trudged off into the wilderness, sleeping in haystacks, dodging highwaymen, and occasionally dealing with the awkward stares of tavern owners when you announced your profession. Being a traveling executioner was the medieval equivalent of being the world's most hated traveling salesman. You'd arrive in some town, stake your claim at the gallows ground, and immediately be treated like a cross between a demon and an unwanted in-law. No one spoke to you, no one sold you proper food, the local priest might refuse to offer a blessing. But on execution day, oh, suddenly you were everyone's best friend. Could you make it extra bloody, sir? Will you let my nephew swing the sword? Is it true a condemned man's blood can cure gout? People are disgusting. And believe it or not, sometimes executioners liked being itinerant, because it meant you could skip out on the social exile you suffered back home. In a strange town, you might be a monster, but you weren't their monster. And besides, fresh crowds, new gallows, different terrified screams. Variety's the spice of life. Now, let's address one of the grimmest aspects of the job: executing the innocent. It happened more often than anyone cared to admit. Medieval justice was a chaotic blend of hearsay, superstition, and open bribery. Justice might be whatever the town magistrate, a local noble, or an angry mob decided it was that morning. You might be asked to hang a man because his neighbor's goat died mysteriously, or burn a woman because a hailstorm hit the village after she sneezed on market day. The evidence could be as thin as he looked at me funny. And you carried it out, not because you wanted to, not because you believed it, but because the alternative was joining them on the scaffold. Medieval towns didn't tolerate moral objectors, especially not from executioners. Refusing to perform an execution was considered both treason and heresy. And besides, what were you going to do? Become a farmer, a tanner, a peasant? Good luck, friend. No one hires the man who kills criminals for a living to watch their pigs. Some executioners tried to cope by distancing themselves emotionally. You might invent nicknames for your victims: Old Squinty, the Crier, Dancing Mary. You'd remember them not as people but as jobs. Others turned to drink: ale, wine, mead, anything that could take the edge off. Tavern owners might refuse you service, but there was always a desperate moonshiner on the edge of town, willing to trade a flask for a handful of ill-gotten coins. A rare few took pride in their craft. These were the artisans of agony. The men who practiced their sword swings on hay bales, who measured their nooses with care, who experimented with new ways to make a confession scream its way out of a prisoner's throat. They were as much showmen as killers, choreographing executions like ghastly theater. Some even wrote manuals, recording the best methods for a clean beheading or an efficient disembowelment. These men were both feared and grudgingly admired. Let's not forget the odd legal privileges executioners sometimes had. In certain towns, you were allowed to claim the clothes and personal belongings of the executed, which sounds lucrative until you remember most condemned criminals didn't own much beyond threadbare rags and maybe a spoon. Still, some executioners amassed small fortunes by selling off clothes, shoes, and the occasional copper ring. In a few regions, you could also demand a toll from passing merchants. There are records of executioners setting up roadside gallows as a sort of gruesome toll booth, hang a few thieves in plain sight, then collect bribes from traders desperate to avoid similar treatment. It was extortion, but in the charmingly hypocritical way medieval justice loved, and every now and then you got to perform a reprieve, the last-minute pardon. Some condemned souls were spared thanks to royal decrees, miraculous visions, or a particularly generous bribe delivered to the magistrate's wife. When that happened, you, the executioner, had to announce the pardon before the crowd, often mere seconds before the axe fell. It made for great theater. The gasps, the tears, the angry drunks shouting that they'd paid good money for a beheading, and by God, they wanted to see one. Of course, pardons didn't always come on time. There are tales of messengers arriving breathless at the gallows ground, scroll in hand, only to find the condemned's head already rolling in the dust. In those cases, you shrugged, wiped the blood off your axe, and declared that the will of God had clearly overridden the king's. A convenient excuse, considering the alternative was probably your own turn on the scaffold. And what of women? Yes, there were female executioners, though they were vanishingly rare. More commonly, women in your line of work acted as torturers' assistants, prison guards, or midwives to condemned mothers forced to give birth in the dungeon. And if the child was born alive, guess whose job it was to decide whether it lived? Fun fact, the answer was usually no. Medieval superstition clung to executioners like fleas on a corpse. It was believed your touch could curse livestock, sour milk, or cause a woman to miscarry. People crossed themselves when you passed. Mothers pulled their children away. Strangers spat at your feet. Some towns forced you to wear bells or distinctive clothing so no one would accidentally brush against you. In one German town, the executioner wasn't allowed to drink from the same well as other citizens. And yet, paradoxically, people also sought you out in secret. Executioners were believed to have occult knowledge. Some thought you could cure illnesses, ward off evil spirits, or craft powerful charms from the remains of the dead. A scrap of noose from a hanged man was considered a potent talisman. The fat of an executed criminal, collected discreetly and sold as poor sinners' grease, was believed to heal wounds and repel witches. Imagine walking through the market, knowing half the tallow candles were made from yesterday's heretic. Superstition ran so deep that some towns used executioners as unofficial matchmakers. It was believed a woman cursed with infertility might conceive if an executioner blessed her. How exactly that blessing was delivered varies in the records, but let's just say the medieval world was endlessly creative and chronically unhygienic. As for the state of your health, don't get attached. Medieval medicine being what it was, you probably carried a buffet of diseases. You worked around open wounds, blood, pus, and rotting bodies. Cuts, scrapes, and splinters were constant. Infection was inevitable. Some executioners developed grotesque deformities, gnarled hands from constant axe swinging, facial scars from panicked prisoners, and in one recorded case, an ear bitten off by a condemned man during a botched hanging. And because you couldn't enter churches or participate in holy rites, if you died unexpectedly, a festering wound, a fall from the scaffold, or an unfortunate accident involving an angry mob, your burial options were limited. Most were interred in unconsecrated ground, often near the gallows where they'd worked, buried by torchlight, with as little ceremony as possible. No prayers, no grave markers, just a hole in the dirt and a hasty shovelful of earth. And so, the life of a medieval executioner trudged on. Day after day, blood after blood, curse after curse, because for every head you took, there was always another waiting, and always a town ready to cheer. And now, we arrive at the final chapter of our nightmarish little tour through medieval executioner life. The slow, inevitable collapse. Because, as you might have guessed by now, nobody retires from this job with a pension, a cottage by the sea, and grandchildren bouncing on their knee. No, the ending to every medieval executioner's story is either tragic, grotesque, or both, much like the life they were forced to lead. Let's talk about aging first. Swinging an axe for a living is a young man's profession. A steady hand, strong shoulders, and decent eyesight are essential when you're expected to sever a man's neck with a single stroke. But medieval medicine wasn't known for extending careers. If you lived long enough to start graying at the temples or developing arthritis, you became a liability. A sloppy executioner was a public relations disaster, and a spectacle too messy could turn the townsfolk against you. You could be the most reviled man in town, but they still expected you to keep things tidy. Older executioners were sometimes demoted to torture duty, a job that required less physical precision and more willingness to twist a thumbscrew until someone promised to confess they were the Pope's illegitimate goat. Others were reduced to menial roles, digging graves, cleaning blood from the scaffold, or disposing of bodies no one else dared touch. And if you thought medieval retirement homes were a thing, well, they were. They were called graveyards. Executioners rarely died of old age. Disease, accidents, and mob violence claimed most of them. It wasn't uncommon for a botched beheading or a particularly cruel hanging to enrage a drunken crowd into storming the gallows. You might be pelted with stones, chased into the woods, or, in rare poetic instances, lynched on the very rope you'd prepared for someone else. The moral of the story: live by the noose, die by the noose. Some towns offered pensions or small plots of land to retired executioners, but those were usually in the most god-forsaken corners of the countryside, where you could live out your remaining years haunted by the faces of the dead and an endless supply of bad wine. And considering how despised you were by the church, you could forget about receiving last rites or a Christian burial. Your final resting place was likely to be a hastily dug ditch at the edge of a gallows field, with a few muttered curses from passing beggars as your eulogy. But before you reached that grim end, there was always the chance of becoming infamous. A handful of executioners became legends in their own time, not because they were beloved, but because they were notorious. Men like Jack Ketch in 17th century England, whose bungled executions were so gruesomely incompetent that his name became a byword for every executioner thereafter. Or Franz Schmidt, the meticulous 16th century German executioner who documented every one of his 394 executions in a diary, complete with grisly details and his own musings on morality, fate, and whether his job made him damned. These men occupied a strange place in society. Both feared and grudgingly respected, they were sometimes sought out for their supposed supernatural abilities. A severed hand from one of their victims was believed to cure epilepsy. The blood of a freshly executed man was rumored to treat leprosy, gout, and even impotence, which made you, dear executioner, something of an unwilling apothecary. There were recorded instances of desperate townsfolk storming the scaffold after a hanging to dip cloth in the victim's blood, or collect a lock of hair from a decapitated head while you tried not to gag into your boots. And while most executioners were considered social pariahs, there were rare moments when they wielded political power. In times of upheaval, plague, famine, rebellion, the man with the axe was suddenly very important. Local lords and magistrates leaned heavily on executioners to maintain order, and since you knew everyone's secrets, torture will do that. You held a kind of grim leverage. An executioner who knew when to keep his mouth shut could carve out a niche of influence, even as the townsfolk crossed themselves whenever he passed. Then came the festivals and public holidays. Ironically, these were some of your busiest seasons. Executions were often scheduled to coincide with religious feast days or market fairs, ensuring maximum attendance. Picture it, a town square decorated for Saint Whatever's Day, children chasing one another with sticks, vendors hawking pies and ale, and you, standing by a gallows, mentally rehearsing the order of the hangings like a stage manager for a horrific play. And let's not gloss over the absolute weirdness of medieval superstitions surrounding your work. It was believed that an executioner's axe had magical properties. Touching it could bring good luck or cure diseases, which is particularly rich coming from the same people who'd cross the street to avoid looking you in the eye. There were even cases where townsfolk would secretly bury splinters of the scaffold under their doorstep for protection against evil spirits. The same scaffold you spent half your life scraping blood off with a stick. But no matter how many deaths you dealt, or how thick the superstitions clung, you were always one accident away from becoming a client of your own profession. If a prisoner escaped under your watch, if you botched an execution in front of a noble, if you killed a man without a proper warrant, Your career ended with you standing on the other side of the scaffold, blinking in surprise as some younger, better-fed executioner swung your own axe at your throat. And sometimes, even death wasn't the end of your troubles. In towns with especially nasty reputations, it wasn't unusual for executioners' bodies to be exhumed and desecrated years after death. Bones scattered, graves overturned, skulls thrown into rivers, all because the good Christian folk of medieval Europe believed your evil might seep into the earth and poison their crops. Which brings us, finally, to legacy. What did a medieval executioner leave behind? Not wealth, not honor, not loving descendants eager to carry on your name. Most executioners left behind a battered set of tools, a trail of curses, and perhaps a few illegitimate children destined for the same miserable fate. Their names, if recorded at all, survive only in the margins of town ledgers or in the diaries of fascinated weirdos like Franz Schmidt. Yet despite it all, someone always took the job. Every town had one, because for all its horror, the role of executioner was essential. Medieval justice was performative, a bloody morality play designed to terrify peasants into obedience. Without someone to swing the axe, stretch the rack, and light the pyres, the entire charade collapsed. The townsfolk needed their monsters, and those monsters, in turn, needed someone to be worse than them. That someone was you. So the next time you're watching a medieval film or reading some dusty history book that glosses over the gruesome mechanics of medieval justice, spare a thought for the poor wretch in the corner, wiping gore off his boots, carefully stacking heads in a basket, and knowing full well that the very people cheering him today might stone him tomorrow. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that being the hand of justice is only fun when it isn't your own neck on the block. And that, my friends, is what it was like to be a medieval executioner. Imagine a world where your daily shower is a 2-hour pilgrimage through fetid alleyways, cockroaches serve as your only shampoo, and the word soap is as mythical as unicorns. Welcome to personal hygiene during the Black Death, where cleaning yourself was more dangerous than the plague itself. You awake in a damp, cramped hovel, the stench of last week's sweat still clinging to your tunic like a barnacle on a ship's hull. Before the sun peeks over the rooftops, you must face the day's first challenge. Finding water that isn't already tainted with someone else's leavings. Running taps don't exist. Only communal wells, each one a bubbling cesspit of everything from mud to medieval rumors about plague-bearing rats. You lower your pail, inhale the aroma of stagnant water mixed with hay, and pray the bucket doesn't bring up a floating corpse. Because if it does, you'll have to fish it out yourself. No medieval coroners on call. After hauling back your questionable haul, you tiptoe to the corner of your room where you keep your bath. A wooden tub large enough for half your body. You pour in a ladle of water and gingerly test the temperature with your wrist. It's cold enough to make a pig squeal, but you need to rinse off the grime of yesterday's toil. You strip down, wincing as your bare feet touch the damp floor, and slip into the tub. The water turns black almost instantly as dirt, sweat, and flecks of lice scuttle away from your skin. You wince, but there's no time to be squeamish. The more you stand in that sewage, the greater the chance of lacerations and infection. So you dunk, scrub with a rough wool cloth, and hop out just as your teeth start chattering. Clothing is another saga. Clean shifts are rarer than a kind word from your landlord. You hang yesterday's tunic by the hearth to air out, hoping the smoke will kill some of the stink, and maybe a few fleas, but smoke also stains the fabric and gives you a perpetual case of watery eyes. Still, fresh air is a luxury, and beggars can't be choosers. Underwear? Ha! That's for nobles who believe in touching linen. For most, undergarments are a one-time investment, washed in the same bucket of water until they disintegrate entirely. Hair and grooming rituals are equally laughable. A true bath, complete with soap, is a rarity reserved for royalty, or for times when a plague wave hasn't killed half the populace. Instead, you rely on vinegar water to rinse your hair, poured from a cracked jug. The smell is noxious, but vinegar was believed to ward off disease. You slather it on, rub it through tangles of greasy hair, and let it sit. The acidic sting makes you cough, but you endure, hoping the vinegar somehow keeps the plague at bay. After rinsing, if you can salvage enough clean water, you attempt a haircut. Barbers of the era double as surgeons and executioners, so your Saturday trim might include a quick lancet bleed to balance your humors. You leave with a lopsided haircut and a fresh welt from the barber's blade, convinced you might have been better off looking like a scarecrow. Oral hygiene? The idea of brushing teeth didn't exist. Instead, you chew on sticks soaked in herbs, rosemary, mint, whatever the apothecary sells for a penny. You rub the stick across your teeth a few times, hoping to dislodge the bits of yesterday's gruel. Afterward, you rinse with wine if you can afford it, wine being considered safer than water as it's boiled during fermentation. As you swish, you savor the bitter taste, imagining it banishes the black death lurking in your gums. Feet bear the brunt of your efforts, or lack thereof. You wear leather shoes held together by straps, and between your toes lurk a colony of fungi and plague-carrying fleas. Whenever you take them off, the air reaches your skin only briefly before your toes turn purple and your heel cracks. To treat the cracks, you smear a paste of ashes and lard, which smells like burnt bacon but works better than nothing. You remember that a neighbor's blisters once turned into plague buboes, so you're wary of any lesion. Still, with no antiseptic beyond vinegar and a prayer, you do the best you can. Daily washing of hands is practically unheard of. Sick or not, everyone uses the same towel, and sometimes no towel at all. After relieving yourself in the chamber pot, emptied into the street at dawn, you wipe your hands on your tunic and move on. Townsfolk sprinkle frankincense and burn incense to mask the odors, but the smell of excrement never fully disappears. You avoid touching your face, knowing that the plague enters through mucous membranes, but your neighbor's toddler still grabs your arm, and before you know it, you're scraping your nails on your own sleeves in despair. Public baths were once popular, but by the time the plague struck, most were closed. Fear reigned. No one wanted to share a steaming tub with strangers who might cough bubonic death into the water. Some towns required bathhouses to register the names of each bather, turning hygiene into a public records nightmare. And then, just as you turned your key, the church decreed that bathing loosened the skin's pores, letting the black death slip in. Cleanliness became associated with sin, and bathing was shunned in favor of avoiding baths at all costs. Naked shrines, quite literally dirty, were abandoned, and dirt became a badge of piety. Yet amidst all this filth, superstition flourished. You might rub a charm around your neck, an Alexandrian mirror, or a pouch of dried toads, to ward off miasma. You bathed your hands in urine, believing the ammonia would sterilize you. Pregnant women drank concoctions of crushed vipers to avert miscarriage, and merchants sold plague beads soaked in rose oil for exorbitant prices. The irony is that none of it helped. The only defense against the pestilence was isolation, and most couldn't afford to barricade themselves inside. But life goes on, plague or no plague. You rise at dawn, scrape the crust from your eyes, and daub your face with clay to hide blemishes. You braid your hair loosely to keep it away from your mouth. You smear your body with scented herbs if you can find them, hoping to fool fate. Then you step outside, past the mass graves being dug on the outskirts, past your neighbors clutching candles in fear, and into the stench of a city slowly rotting alive. And that, dear viewers, is just the start of part 1. Next time, we'll dive deeper into the absurd remedies, the frantic beauty rituals, and the desperate measures people took when the very concept of hygiene became a deadly gamble. Stay tuned. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but during the Black Death, it was more like a death sentence. And now, brave souls, we plunge even deeper into the gruesome spa of the Black Death era, where daily life felt like an obstacle course in a sewage log slaughterhouse, and hygiene was the punchline of a cosmic joke. In part 2, we'll explore the madcap world of plague-era beauty rituals, desperate home remedies, and the social fallout of a society that learned the hard way that soap is optional, but fear is mandatory. First on the docket, the Great Stink Contest. When the smell of rot became the backdrop of every street, townsfolk turned reefers of rosemary, lavender, and juniper into the must-have accessory. Like medieval face masks, if face masks smelled like overcooked cabbage, people stuffed their tunics and hoods with herb pouches, clamped posies under their noses, and even soaked handkerchiefs in vinegar just to venture beyond their hovels without fainting. In some places, vendors hawked plague gloves lined with aromatic feathers. Never mind that the same gloves had been dipped in the same stench-soaked water for a week. So long as they smelled like oranges and gum resin, the illusion of safety was enough. But the true star of the plague perfume show was the pomander, a little metal ball filled with fragrant powders and wet sponges steeped in oils. The wealthiest burghers swung them on chains, hoping that a swirl of cinnamon, ambergris, or rosewater might ward off the miasma spiraling from every open grave. They paid fortunes for musk imported from mythical eastern lands, convinced that the only thing more lethal than the Black Death was a bad body odor. Yet as they paraded through the streets, their pomanders clanked and clattered, a sound that must have resembled a choir of rattling bones given the circumstances. Meanwhile, the lower classes, or those too broke to buy pomanders, turned to makeshift remedies that ranged from the merely absurd to the outright lethal. Let us not forget the legendary toad poultice, wherein people would mash live toads into a pulp, smear the muck onto their arms, and believe that the toad's toxins would chase the plague from their veins. In reality, they were just creating the world's nastiest sunburn and inviting secondary poisoning, because medieval medical science was little more than alchemy and wishful thinking. Next came the bloodletting salons. Ah yes, when you couldn't wash the plague off, you might as well bleed it out. Barbers with more enthusiasm than skill wielded lancets, leeches, and copper cups to drain your bad humors. You'd recline on a wooden bench as they snipped veins and stuck leeches to your flesh, hoping the flow of red magic would siphon away the bubus. Of course, most victims died of shock or exsanguination before the plague had a chance to show itself, so technically it was an effective elimination method, just for the wrong plague. Let's pause to consider the apothecary ads plastered in city squares. Posters hawked the galenic elixir, guaranteed to expunge contagion, the mercurial tonic promising bodily purification, and the maggot paste, which was exactly what it sounded like, ground up maggots mixed with honey and grease. People smeared this maggot mess on their chests, certain that if the live humors could eat away rotting flesh, they could likewise devour plague itself. Instead, they ended up cultivating fly farms beneath their skin, an unintentional side effect that made the buboes look positively teeming with life. Meanwhile, the churches tried their hand at cleanliness, strictly on spiritual terms. Priests declared that the plague was divine punishment for sin, so the remedy was repentance, prayer, and ceremony. Congregations swelled for Mass, despite the irony of cramming coughing parishioners into wooden pews. Holy water fonts were shared by everyone, and some priests even conducted plague blessings, walking barefoot through infected neighborhoods, sprinkling holy water on children, and singing hymns that probably served as the world's most tragic soundtrack. The logic? If God struck you with the plague, only more God could save you. And if God didn't, well, at least you died with the congregation. In the absence of real knowledge, quarantine became a buzzword, and a slapdash exercise in social cruelty. Wealthy households could bolt their doors, shutter their windows, and live off stored grain while the rest of the town shrieked on the other side. But for the vast majority, self-isolation meant staying in your two-room hovel with the widow down the lane and her 6 kid siblings, all sharing one chamber pot. Families erected makeshift barriers of straw bales in doorways, sprinkled juniper branches on thresholds, and tied red ribbons to their gates to signal that death lurked within. Visitors were supposed to leave food outside the door, but more often the gate was simply left bolted, and those inside were left to stew in their own filth until they shuffled off this mortal coil. As the plague raged on, personal cleanliness slid from unlikely to impossible. Water sources dried up or turned fetid, wells collapsed, pipes clogged with mud and rot. When you scooped water for washing, you risked pulling up debris, anything from a shriveled rat carcass to a medieval sandal. Winds carried the stench for miles, turning entire regions into ill-omened fog banks of decay. And with each new wave of sickness, towns sealed their gates, leaving fugitives and beggars to wander the countryside, dirt-caked, disease-ridden, and often executed on sight as suspected carriers. But adversity breeds creativity, and some folks tried to fashion their own hygiene appliances. One enterprising alchemist invented the plague shower, a contraption of leaky leather buckets hoisted above a clapboard platform. You'd stand underneath while someone poured vinegar water from above, hoping the acid would kill the invisible bacteria, or whatever it was they thought caused the plague. Though the setup dissolved faster than the germs did, it was still preferable to dunking in someone else's sewage bucket. In wealthier households, the cooks and maids took hygiene into their own hands, literally. Kitchens stored barrels of salted water for rinsing dishes and pots. Floors were swept daily with bundles of twigs dipped in herb-infused oil. The cooks wore linen caps to trap hair, lest a stray lock end up in a pot of porridge. Not out of altruism, mind you, but because losing the household to fire or riot over spoiled stew was worse than risking a few fleas. Servants risked their lives fetching water from distant springs, carrying heavy jars balanced on their shoulders, dodging carts and filth-choked roads. Their reward? Probably the plague. Meanwhile, fashion became a form of hygiene theater. Since people couldn't scrub themselves clean, they scrubbed their clothes instead, when they had any. Petticoats and doublets were beaten on open-air racks to dislodge dust, lice, and God knows what else. Sturdy wooden paddles slapped the fabric, sending clouds of grime into the sky. Bright dyes and intricate embroideries served to distract from the smell, or at least to make the victim look elegant while they were dying. Lace collars trapped dirt like a filter, requiring delicate cleaning rituals that only the wealthy could afford. Children, of course, skipped the hygiene lessons altogether. They rolled in pig slops, rubbed mud on each other's faces, and considered bathing a form of torture. Parents sprayed them with vinegar when they looked particularly snotty, but by the afternoon, the kids were back in the gutter, chasing chickens and picking through refuse. The plague paid little heed to age, and you'd see entire families, infants and elders alike, snatched by fever and bubo. The streets became littered with raggedy patches of abandoned clothing where someone had died mid-flight or mid-game, leaving behind a tether of scarves and hats fluttering in the breeze. And then there were the volunteers, the brave souls who tried to clean up the streets. Often hired by the city council, these washers pushed wheelbarrows loaded with lime and quicklime, sprinkling powder on the cobbles to disinfect them. They wore thick gloves, straw hats, and masks fashioned from animal bladders with glass eyes inserted. It was as close as you got to PPE in 1348. Their job, scrub away the blood and pus, collect the bodies of plague victims for mass graves, and bury them alive if they weren't quite dead yet. Yes, sometimes they sealed a live person in a mass grave. The convulsions and muffled screams echoing beneath the soil were part of the job. They were paid a pittance. Many died of exposure, exhaustion, or insurgent mobs that blamed them for spreading the witchcraft of cleaning. As the months dragged on, despair settled over hygiene like a thick miasma. Town bans were issued against spitting, urinating in public squares, or disposing of garbage near wells. Rules nobody enforced because who was left to enforce them? Church bells tolled daily for the dead. Abandoned buildings housed feral dogs gnawing on anyone foolish enough to leave a body unclaimed. It became a matter of survival to avoid other humans, their coughs, their touch, their lice-ridden hair. Finally, as the spring thaw arrived, survivors emerged from quarantine, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and harboring a devout suspicion of water. They carried on as best they could, wearing the habits of the plague year like battle scars. Some never washed again. A lifetime of disgust had muted their desire for cleanliness. Soap became a rare spice. Wells were deemed cursed, and as the Black Death receded into grim memory, hygiene practices regressed only slightly because centuries would pass before Europe rediscovered baths, soap, and the concept that cleanliness might actually be next to godliness. Welcome back, fearless viewers, to our filthy journey through the desperate lengths medieval Europeans went to keep clean amid the Black Death. In Part 3, we delve into the day-to-day survival strategies, the ingenious and often revolting household hacks, and how entire professions sprang up around the corpse-strewn streets. Grab your smallest pinch of hand sanitizer and steel yourselves. This bit gets messier than a surgeon's apron. Once you've survived the worst of the plague's first wave, you confront the new normal, life among the dead and dying. The stench of decay becomes your constant companion, more familiar than your own shadow. It pervades homes, shops, even the stinkiest taverns. Inns offer rooms quarantined against plague, but the thin wooden walls do little to keep rotting flesh at bay. Desperate travelers pay double for a nightly stay, only to wake up coughing into the corner and finding a rat turned into a snack by the local dogs. Given this grim backdrop, medieval households improvised a host of cleanliness shortcuts. The sweat lodge-style steam bath was one such hack. You'd hang damp sheets over a brazier, crawl inside like a trapped cockroach, and sweat until the room felt like a witch's kettle. The idea was that steam opened your pores and expelled bad humors, but in practice you mostly drowned in your own sweat, emerged dizzy, and promptly vomited into a chamber pot. Another time-saving tip: dry washing. A soap maker in Florence once advertised a powder so fine and so corrosive that you could sprinkle it onto your body, rub vigorously, and call it a bath. The powder, made from ground pumice, ash, and lye, stripped away grime, but also peeled layers of skin. Survivors reported smooth elbows, but at the cost of raw, weeping welts that attracted flies like neon signs. Then there was the nose hook, or plague mask. Long before the iconic beak appeared in art, lower-class townspeople wrapped scraps of linen over their mouths, soaked in fragrant oils. Over time, these fabric muzzles grew so thick with grime, sweat, and body oils that they became rancid sponges of bacteria. People would pass them among family members like heirlooms, unaware that their protective device had become its own source of contagion. By part 3 of the epidemic, the term freshly laundered meant wiped off with a damp rag this morning. With hygiene standards so low, an entire cottage industry of cleaners cropped up, known as plague washers. These hardy souls wore leather aprons, thick gloves, and hoods fashioned from animal skins, then shoveled rotting refuse from streets and markets into wheelbarrows. Their motto: if it moves, push it. And they meant both broken carts and half-dead beggars. For a modest fee, they hauled away the bodies of the recently deceased, sometimes while still twitching. Families who couldn't pay resorted to dumping corpses in mass pits, where lime dusting was supposed to speed decomposition, but often just made the whole affair dustier and more unpleasant. Inside homes, chamber pots piled up. With outdoor waste disposal outlawed in plague-stricken towns, people took to lining pots with straw and herbs, sage, rue, lavender, hoping the scent would mask the undertones of human excrement. At dawn, night soil collectors banged on doors, shouting, "Night soil, coins for your cess." Families tossed down the pots, and the collectors hauled them away on carts, bells jingling to warn pedestrians. The bells weren't to attract business, but to scare rats and humans away from the filthy cargo. Locals joked that if you heard the bells, you should hold your breath, pray a Hail Mary, and cross yourself thrice. Perhaps the most astonishing medieval invention was the portable lavatory. Wealthy nobles commissioned oak chests fitted with chambers for straining liquids, solids, and straw. A servant would wheel this contraption into the garden, open the side hatch, and tip the contents into a moat or cesspit. Ironically, in some castles the moat served as both defense and sewer, creating a delightful swirl of frogs, feces, and fetid water that would eventually seep back into the drinking supply. Meanwhile, villagers clung to ancient superstitions, fusing hygiene with magical thinking. There was the ring of salt ceremony, sprinkling salt around doorways to ward off plague spirits, or the smoke-out ritual, burning poisonous herbs like hellebore in enclosed rooms to fumigate both occupants and insects. When those failed, they resorted to sacrificial offerings, dropping live chickens into wells so that misfortune would claim the fowl instead of the water. If the chicken died, well, the well was poisoned. If it lived, villagers congratulated themselves on the purity of their drinking source, until the next typhoid outbreak proved otherwise. Public health edicts appeared sporadically. Town councils banned public funerals, forced plazas to be swept daily, and prohibited dogs from entering market squares. These measures, while well-intentioned, often backfired. Sweepers simply shifted rubbish from one corner to another. Banned dogs scavenged in alleys, peeing on every door they passed. And without market dogs to scare off rats, merchants complained of missing wares. A polite way of saying rats nibbled through every barrel of grain. Sanitation officers known as bell ringers patrolled streets, sounding warning bells whenever they spotted a household with plague symptoms. But the bell system lacked nuance. Any cough, any fever, even a night of overindulgence in ale could earn you a clang of doom. Once marked, your house was quarantined, doors nailed shut, windows bricked up, and a red cross painted above the lintel. Food and water were typically left on a bench outside, if the delivery boy didn't catch the plague himself first. Desperate residents sometimes attempted escape tunnels, only to find themselves shot by guards protecting uninfected districts. In villages, communal latrines were located at the far edge of town, next to the leper colony and the gallows. Using them meant braving undead whispers and the flutter of diseased kites overhead. A superstitious villager lodged straw in his ears, wrapped his face in a heavy scarf, and sprinted to the pit latrine at dawn, hoping to avoid the midday plague fairies said to dance atop the fence. At the heart of every medieval hamlet was the healer or barber surgeon, a jack of all trades who dispensed poultices and shaving razors in equal measure. Patients waited all day for their turn. A half-hour shave, a leech application, and a draught of herbal warming wine, rumored to break fever. By evening, the barber's basin ran red with blood and ale, an excellent base for the next day's leech therapy. By the time part 3 of the Black Death rolled around, people had grown too weary to bathe at all. Entire neighborhoods reeked so badly that passing carriages were convinced they'd stumbled into an alchemist's lab gone wrong. Bathhouses, once bustling social hubs, lay abandoned and overgrown. Signs reading "closed for plague" swung on broken hinges. Urban myths sprouted that the last bather inside was still alive, preserved by scalding water, waiting for someone to light the fire again. Yet out of this squalor bloomed grim ingenuity. Some craftsmen built smoke chimneys, simple brick stacks behind taverns that funneled smoke from burning herbs into the basement, where furniture makers worked, believing the aroma would sterilize wood and skin alike. Others rigged drip buckets above doorways, so anyone entering received a dousing of vinegar water. It wasn't pleasant, but at least you had the illusion of being cleansed before touching oil lamps, wooden beams, or each other. For women, the practicalities of menstrual hygiene became even more nightmarish. Cloth rags soaked in vinegar were reused for months, drying on rafters between uses. Some nuns experimented with moss and wool padding, but the materials bred mold and fungus. A cloth left damp in a dark cupboard could sprout mildew so dense it resembled cobwebs. Mothers warned daughters that to ignore a stained shift was to invite sin, and possibly the plague, into the body. Children fared slightly better. Parents, desperate to stave off disease, dunked their kids into wooden troughs filled with annually boiled water, mixtures of spring water and scented bark. The process lasted mere seconds. Into the trough, out again, hurried dress, and a crust of goose grease rubbed on shoulders to seal in cleansing. Children ran shrieking into the yard, hair plastered to their heads, cheeks bright red, and promptly rolled in pig feed as soon as adult attention shifted. Markets remained a focal point of contagion. Stallholders drained off old wine into barrels, then reused the sour dregs to wash their wares, fish, cheese, even bread. Buyers, thinking the wine imbued the goods with prestige and antiseptic properties, paid premium prices, but the practice turned markets into hotbeds of mold, maggots, and rodentia conventions. Buying cheese meant risking salmonella. Purchasing fish meant dodging wax moth larvae. Yet people lined up in shoulder-to-shoulder crowds, haggling over prices while clutching herb-filled sachets for protection. Finally, as the worst wave of the Black Death passed, survivors emerged with a newfound aversion to water. Many refused to bathe for months, believing the plague must have seeped into rivers and lakes. Wells were surrounded by shrines to saints, where townsfolk lit candles in prayer rather than draw water. Public fountains went dry, either sealed by order or neglected until the pumps froze in winter. People resorted to dew collection, spreading cloths in the pasture at dawn to soak up morning moisture. The damp fabric was then wrung into bowls for drinking and washing, yielding about a teaspoon of water per rag. And so we arrive at the end of our dusty, disease-ridden odyssey through part 3. Next time, in part 4, we'll explore the long-term fallout, how the plague reshaped attitudes toward cleanliness, the rise of municipal sanitation, and the awkward rebirth of baths in the centuries that followed. Until then, hold on to your cloth masks, cherish your soap bars, and consider every hot shower a triumph of modern hygiene over medieval horror. And so, dear viewers, we've survived the cancerous miasma of Part 3's filth-filled horrors. In this grand finale, we'll witness how the Black Death's carnage forced a reckoning with dirt, disease, and despair, and how the aftermath laid the shaky foundations for modern cleanliness. Brace yourselves. In the Middle Ages, progress was measured in soap bubbles and stink droughts. First, let's survey the immediate aftermath. By the time the plague's last bones were picked clean in the 1350s, Europe had lost up to half its population. Entire villages lay abandoned. their wells clogged with debris and their streets choked with the carcasses of livestock. Survivors emerged blinking into bright sunlight, blinking away the stench of rot. Their first instinct? Scrub everything. Walls, floors, ceilings. Any surface that had seen a human soul was scrubbed with sand, ash, or the precious wood ash soap that local potash makers had cobbled together. Mortar joints were pried apart and washed. Tapestry weavers boiled old tapestries in cauldrons to purge fleas. Bakers burned their ovens to kill hidden vermin. It was medieval spring cleaning on a terrifying scale, and it lasted for years, but resources were scarce. Wood for fires was more precious than gold. Ash for soap making had to be rationed. Wells still tasted like damp death. Enterprising survivors scavenged potsherds, animal bones, and even oyster shells to fashion primitive scrubbing implements. They ground shells into coarse powders, an early exfoliant, then rubbed them across stains and sores until the skin bled. It hurt, but as one grateful peasant wrote in a letter, better pink flesh than blackened buboes. Merchant caravans touted exotic ingredients, sandalwood, olive oil, rose petals, but most commoners made do with soot and vinegar, the twin saints of post-plague hygiene. Amid this madness, municipal authorities woke up. Town councils, once content to wave placards that read, "No dogs, no bodies, no thanks," began drafting sanitation statutes. Streets were to be swept daily, refuse deposited in designated pits, and markets relocated away from residential quarters. Scribes recorded fines for anyone caught spitting near a well or dumping entrails in a gutter. Public latrines were built over rivers rather than beside them, ensuring waste flowed downstream and away from the town proper. It wasn't perfect, rivers still carried the stench, but it was a start. The real revolution, however, was the rebirth of the public bathhouse. Where once bathhouses had been condemned as dens of sin and infection, post-plague reformers rebranded them as healing houses. Architects redesigned them with stone drainage channels, raised stone benches to keep bathers above the filth, and separate pools for hot, warm, and cold baths. Wealthy guilds funded these ventures, donating land and funds to spread the gospel of cleanliness. Suddenly, the lunks who once thought daily washing was for fops were lining up with towels under their arms, though admittedly with less enthusiasm than they'd once queued to see an execution. Barber surgeons also evolved. No longer content to slit throats, they embraced the promise of hygiene. Shops displayed gleaming copper basins, pitchers of clean spring water, and shelves stacked with soap cakes stamped with guild insignias. Razors were sterilized in boiling water between clients, and leeches, once the bloodletting terror of the plague, were repurposed for legitimate medical uses, carefully regulated by newly formed medical boards. The barber's pole, once a symbol of bloodletting, was reinterpreted as a striped sign for "I care about your health." In the countryside, monasteries led the charge, heirs to Roman aqueducts and bath traditions. Many monasteries maintained working baths and aqueduct-fed fountains. Monks wrote treatises on waterborne illness and proper bathing techniques, combining scripture with practical advice. Bathe monthly in winter, weekly in summer, scrub elbows and knees thrice, underarms twice, and feet always. These manuals circulated among nobility who installed bathing chambers in manor houses, wooden tubs lined with lead sheeting, fed by rooftop rainwater cisterns. Lighthouses and watching towers even featured small plunge pools for guards weary of long nights on watch. Meanwhile, the Guild of Soap Makers blossomed into a powerful trade. Coastal towns in France and Spain, blessed with ample wood ash from olive presses, produced Marseille soap, hard, long-lasting bars perfumed with lavender and rosemary. Traders exported these bars across Europe, where they were prized beyond gold. In England, merchants lobbied King Edward III to tax soap imports, arguing they were essential to public health. Parliament balked. 15th century MPs were quick to approve war taxes but squeamish about soap suds. But the debate marked a turning point. Cleanliness was officially recognized as more than vanity. Urban planners rediscovered the wisdom of the Romans. Cities like Florence and Venice invested in aqueduct repairs, restoring fresh water supplies to fountains and public taps. Citizens queued for clean water as eagerly as they had once queued for bread. In Venice, the Great Council mandated that every palazzo install a latrine connected to the lagoon via a water channel, an ingenious, if unsavory system that flushed waste away with the tides. The Porta della Pulizia, Gate of Cleanliness, became a point of civic pride. Education also got a scrub, universities reopened their doors, and medical schools rewrote curricula. Gone were the chapters endorsing urine baths and bloodletting as panaceas. In came lectures on hand-washing, wound irrigation, and the use of herbal antiseptics like myrrh and thyme. Students dissected animals not only to learn anatomy, but to test cleaning agents on tissue. One Florentine professor recommended a mixture of wine and honey for wound dressing, antibacterial properties unknown, but far preferable to poultices of maggots. Over the next century, social attitudes shifted. Bathing transformed from a sinful temptation to a civic duty. Even the church, once suspicious of baths, blessed public fountains and encouraged pilgrims to purify themselves before prayer. Pilgrimage routes featured bathhouses at every major stop, sponsored by monasteries and guilds. By the late 1400s, a popular proverb declared, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," a phrase that would echo through the Renaissance and beyond. Of course, progress was never linear. Plague recurred in waves through the 15th and 16th centuries, and with each resurgence, people briefly returned to old habits: barricades, vinegar masks, home cordons of straw, in the dread of baths. Local councils repealed sanitation laws under pressure. Churches forbade vain show in bathhouses, and fleas found new caches in neglected upholstery. But each relapse was shorter than the last. By 1600, Europe had largely embraced the basics: clean water, organized waste disposal, and a culture that viewed daily washing as ordinary rather than sinful. And what of the common folk? They too adapted. Artisans formed washers' guilds to train specialists in linen care. Barge operators ferried women's clothes for wholesale laundering in river rapids, and itinerant soap sellers peddled hardened, perfumed bars to peasants desperate for relief from the stink of open sewers. Market towns installed public soap dispensers alongside wells, crocks of lye solution next to wooden buckets, allowing bathers to clean their pails even if they couldn't afford a full wash. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the memory of plague-era filth fueled a hygiene mania. Pamphlets and books taught mothers how to swaddle babies in freshly laundered cloth. Surgeons insisted on operating gloves long before Pasteur, and city planners designed sewage systems beneath streets, knowing that hidden gutters were better than piles of refuse. The catastrophic Black Death had been humanity's horrific wake-up call, a warning that in the battle against disease, dirt is the true enemy. In our modern age, with showers that blast away yesterday's sins at the push of a button, it's tempting to scoff at medieval misery. But remember, without the desperate scrubbing, the municipal edicts, and the survivors' vow to never again let waste choke their homes, we might still be bathing in cesspits. So next time you lather up, spare a thought for those who scrubbed in wooden tubs with dirt-blackened water, who gambled with vinegar masks, and who, against all odds, nudged the world toward the simple idea that clean is not just next to godliness, it's essential for life itself. And that, friends, is the end of our bleak, bubbly odyssey, what personal hygiene was like during the Black Death. May your showers be hot, your soap be plentiful, and your sense of historical gratitude ever strong. Hey folks, imagine carving wedges of wet clay from sunrise to sunset, your fingers stained with ink made of soot and spit, while the temple's high priest watches your every stroke. Welcome to your glamorous life as a Mesopotamian temple scribe, where paperwork is literal, deadlines are divine, and one misplaced wedge can mean the difference between eternal praise and being fed to the cuneiform furnace. You wake before dawn in your one-room mud-brick lodging, roused by the distant wail of temple bells and the smell of last night's stale barley porridge. There's no snooze button here, only the bitter taste of date honey on your tongue, and the knowledge that today you will be the mortal hands through which the gods speak to kings and merchants and farmers alike. You sling your woolen shawl over your shoulders, adjust the ink pot at your belt, and step out into the dim light of a city still shaking off its slumber. The streets to the temple are a swirl of dust, goat droppings, and the occasional stray dog. No sanitary code to speak of in 2000 BCE. You duck under low-hanging palm fronds and navigate past clay ovens where bakers coo like pigeons over steaming loaves. Every so often, a courtesan in bright lapis lazuli bracelets flutters past, hoping a scribe's tab or two will pay for extra sweet dates. But you have bigger dreams. Today's assignment is a stone stele commemorating the harvest festival for Ningirsu, and it must be flawless. Arriving at the temple courtyard, you're greeted by a chorus of temple attendants, young acolytes carrying oil lamps, cooks ladling porridge into clay bowls, and levy soldiers polishing bronze spear tips. All of them depend on you to commit their offerings, tithes, and temple inventories to writing. Without your hand, chaos reigns. Grain stores go uncounted, debts unrecorded, and offerings vanish like water in the desert. You bow to the ziggurat steps, aware that your work cements the temple's power and the king's legitimacy. Inside the scriptorium, long tables of polished stone await your chiseling. Your tools are simple: a sharpened reed stylus for soft clay, a metal chisel for hard stone, and an ink pot brewing a noxious slurry of soot, water, and animal glue. The clay tablets rest in wooden racks, sorted by type: administrative logs, legal contracts, hymn texts, and astronomical observations. You glance at today's docket: 8 tax receipts, 3 marriage contracts, a letter from the governor of Uruk, in the grand commemorative text destined for the temple's inner sanctum. You start with taxes. Every farmer who brought barley must have his contribution recorded: name, village, amount, date, and the seal of the local elder. You press your stylus into soft clay, forming dainty wedges that represent each syllable. It's repetitive. Village names blend together after tablet 15, and shekel and gur sound suspiciously alike. But you soldier on, mindful that any error could result in a shortfall that angers Ningirsu and by extension, the king. You wipe sweat from your brow, smudge your clay just so, and finish the batch. Off to the kiln it goes. Next, marriage contracts. You've done these 1,000 times, but each is its own little saga. Father of the bride pledges 10 goats. Father of the groom offers 5 silver rings and half a brick of lapis lazuli. You write the conditions. If the groom disputes the bride's dowry, he owes 100 shekels in penalty. You pause at that line, smile at your own dark humor, then carve it crisp and clear. Signatures are pressed by clay cylinder seals, tiny rolling stamps that leave spiraling impressions, much cooler than an autograph. Then comes the governor's letter. He wants a shipment of cedar beams from Lebanon. 18 logs, he writes, for the palace's new throne room. You consider the travel time, the caravan guards needed, the bribes to customs officers at every city gate. You condense all that into a brief missive in your best cursive cuneiform. Dispatch cedar beams. In short procession includes 5 guards with bronze axes. Send estimate of reed boat charges. You dip your stylus, press the clay, and let the ink outlines turn into furrows as the sun climbs higher. All the while, temple supervisors drift in and out, peering over your shoulder. One nods approvingly at your orderly signs. Another frowns at a stray wedge you forgot to trim. You shuffle tablets aside to start on the big one. The festival stele for Ningirsu. Carving into limestone is an entirely different beast. You first sketch the text in charcoal. Invocations, praise lines, descriptions of the festival rituals, how barley stalks will be woven into garlands, how priests will dance with lion skins, how offerings of wine and honeyed dates will appease the god. Then, with chisel in hand, you chip away. Each wedge you carve must match the proportions of the others, or the gods will take offense. You tap carefully, feeling the grain of the stone, and watch powdering chips fall like ancient confetti. Between tasks, you drink from your goatskin waterskin and munch on a hunk of cheese. Fellow scribes gossip about palace intrigues, the crown prince's new scribal tutor from Assyria, the rumor that the temple owes back taxes of its own, whispers that the royal scribe complains this temple's records are sloppy. You smirk, if only he knew of your midnight oil sessions or the time you nearly demolished half a tablet by knocking it off your workbench. As afternoon wanes, dust devils spin in the open courtyard. The kiln fires roar, baking your tablets into permanence. You inspect each one, feel for cracks, read over cuneiform lines until the wedge shapes blur and your eyes water. A mistake now would mean hours of extra work. No scribe in his right mind would admit an error to the high priest. You grit your teeth, roll a bad tablet back to the scriptorium's regex heap, and start anew. Finally, you approach the festival stele's finishing touches. You ink the carved lines to deepen their contrast, buff the surface with a bit of palm oil to give the stone a soft sheen. Temple guards stand at attention as you wheel the heavy slab into the inner shrine, placing it before the gilded statue of Ningirsu. Priests murmur prayers, incense smoke drifts skyward, and you stand back, heart pounding. Your words will echo through generations, read by any who seek the favor of the god. As dusk falls, lanterns flicker to life. You gather your stylus and chisel, wipe them clean in a scrap of linen, and stow them in your leather pouch. The supervisors nod. Today's work is exemplary. You feel a surge of pride until you remember tomorrow's ledger will dwarf today's, and the cycle starts anew. You trudge back through the courtyard, past the flank of sheep awaiting tomorrow's sacrifices, and into the city's winding lanes. Back home, your roommate snores on his reed mat, dreaming of scribal promotions in a far-off temple. You collapse onto your own mat, mind buzzing with wedges and flat impressions. You close your eyes, but the cuneiform shapes dance in your dreams. Tax registers morph into snarling lions. Marriage seals become tiny wailing babies, and the festival stele looms overhead, uncarved and mocking. And so ends part 1 of your life as a Mesopotamian temple scribe. A day filled with divine bureaucracy, stone chiseling drama, and the eternal grind of clay, ink, and chisel. Rest up, because tomorrow you'll repeat it all, and the gods expect nothing less than perfection. You awake the next morning to the shrill clang of the temple's sanctuary bell, echoing through narrow alleys slick with last night's dew and donkey droppings. No leisurely lie-in for you. Dawn signals the return of divine paperwork. Today's schedule arrives on a clay tablet dramatically slung over your shoulder by a junior acolyte. An astronomical observation chart at sunrise, inventories of sacrificial animals by mid-morning, the temple's food distribution records after lunch, and finally, preparations for tomorrow's royal decree. First task, celestial logs. You trudge across the courtyard to the observatory platform perched atop the ziggurat's second tier. Here, the sky is a dome of ink, filled with streaks of Venus, the constellations of the Great Shepherd, and ominous dark patches the priests call the dragon scars. Armed with your stylus and a fresh tablet, you record the positions of stars relative to the temple's central axis. Each wedge mark must capture exact angles. Too much error and the king's astrologer might declare an ill omen. A quick miscalculation could mean postponing a harvest blessing or rerouting a caravan, so you work swiftly but carefully, shading wedge strokes by counting finger joints and the faded tally lines on your tablet frame. By mid-morning, the chill has burned off and the courtyard's heat bakes your back. Next up, livestock counts. Temple herds of sheep, goats, and the prized doves used in purification rites are penned in dusty corrals. You, the humble scribe, stand before a bored shepherd handing you tally sticks. 21 lambs born last month, he growls. 2 ewes lost to foxes. You press wedge symbols into the tablet's soft clay, then flip to inventory live birds in their coops. 367 doves, give or take a stray fledgling. The acolyte at your side, still wide-eyed from lack of breakfast, holds your water jar, trying not to drip grease from his breakfast porridge onto your work. With the livestock inventory sealed and sent off to the temple's granary overseer, you are ushered into the inner storeroom for food distribution logs. Here, baskets of barley, date cakes, salted fish, and jars of olive oil await allocation to temple staff, pilgrims, and the poor. The overseer, a rotund fellow with a clay smear on his cheek, rattles off figures: 50 measures of barley to the priests, 25 rations of fish to the temple musicians, 10 bowls of oil to the sanctuary keepers. You scrawl each line into a fresh tablet, carefully marking who gets what, and tally the totals to ensure nothing vanishes on the way. This part of your job carries real stakes. If you under-record, a low-ranking acolyte might go hungry. Over-record, and you'll be accused of siphoning off temple provisions. By midday, the sun sits hot overhead, turning sand into shimmering mirages. You retreat to your scriptorium for a brief repast. Stale barley bread dipped in goat cheese, washed down with a gulp of cool well water. The senior temple scribe, a lean woman named Enhaduana, no relation to the famous poetess alas, nods at your progress and assigns you the afternoon's big task, drafting the text of tomorrow's royal decree to be inscribed on bronze and displayed in every city gate. Drafting a royal decree is no simple matter. You must capture the king's precise phrasing, an amalgam of modest humility. Your servant, the great king, offers this decree, an absolute authority. Henceforth, any merchant found cheating on weights shall face the king's justice without appeal. You take a clay tablet, flatten the surface, and begin with the formal invocation. By the grace of Anu and Enlil, our king declares, every wedge you carve must reflect regal dignity. Hasty or shaky strokes could be read as disrespect. As you write, a palace messenger hovers, clearly agitated. He's overdue to return to the ziggurat summit with Enheduanna's corrections. You pause to honor his impatience, then resume, each line building on solemn promises of security, fair trade, and divine favor. With the first draft done, you set it aside to dry. The messenger whisks it away, chattering about how the king expects the final bronze inscription by dawn. No pressure. You turn to your final assignment, sealing the temple's financial accounts for the quarter. Ledgers of silver ingots, copper tools, labor rations, and trade goods demand exactitude. You flip through previous clay tablets, some still warm from the kiln, and cross-reference each entry. Temple merchants who traded bitumen for precious metals must have their deals logged. Every discrepancy sparks a detective hunt. Off go two acolytes to reweigh ingots, check for missing tools, or quiz the shrine guardians about unrecorded wares. By late afternoon, your hands ache from stylus work and the sun's heat, but the day isn't over. Enheduanna calls you to the grand hall for finals. The bronze decree must be approved, and Enheduanna's second draft has landed on your bench. You translate the clay draft into cuneiform lines ready for engraving. The bronze carvers, giant men with hammers and chisels, stand by, eager for clarity. Too forceful a strike on each wedge and the lines crack. Too light and the marks won't endure. You must make final edits, often carving guide marks in soft wax sheets before the carvers touch the metal. As dusk falls and torches flicker, you perform the most delicate part of your craft, tracing guidelines on the bronze sheet with an oil-soaked stylus dipped in fine clay powder. One false move and a line goes awry, requiring hours of laborious correction or a complete restart. A single chip in the wrong place could be seen as a curse on the king's mandate. You steady your breath, trace each stroke, and whisper a silent prayer to Nisaba, the goddess of writing, for steady hands. Finally, the decree is handed off to the master carver, who clamps it to a rotating post. Sparks fly as he taps away under torchlight, and you watch the strokes deepen into lasting impressions. You check each wedge, nod, then step back to admire the gleaming bronze tablet etched with royal authority. By the time you slip out of the temple gates, the city is bathed in orange torchlight. Street vendors shout last calls for date wine. Temple guards patrol the walls. You stagger home, dusty and weary, knowing tomorrow will bring more logs, more decrees, and another turn of the sun cycle. Yet there's satisfaction in permanence. Every wedge you carved in clay or bronze is a testament to your skill, your endurance, and your indelible link between gods and mortals. Crumpled clay tablets await your return, dry and sealed, ready for kiln or shrine. But for now, you collapse on your reed mattress, mind echoing with wedge shapes, star patterns, and royal titles. In your dreams, barley grains rain from the sky, and clay tablets whisper, "Record us, Scribe, record us." And tomorrow you will, for the life of a Mesopotamian temple, Scribe never rests. Welcome back, intrepid voyagers, to the next leg of your cuneiform crusade. By now you've tasted the dawn chill atop the ziggurat, wrestled with wedge-shaped taxes, and survived the kiln's inferno. Now it's time to peer behind the temple walls and discover the bizarre backstage drama of being a Mesopotamian scribe. The rivalries, the endless schooling, the divine politics, and the soul-numbing tedium of copying myths in triplicate. Buckle up, because this ride is stickier than a fresh bucket of reed sap ink. School of hard wedges. Before you ever stepped into the temple courtyard, you endured years of scrubbing filthy slate benches in the E-Dubba, the tablet house where scribal novices learned their craft. Picture a sunless hall humming with chanting children, some no older than 8, repeating wedge after wedge until their fingers cramped and their voices cracked. Your instructor, a wizened ex-scribe with soot-blackened fingernails, barked corrections like an angry dove. "No, that's a not am. Again, again." Each misstroke earned a swift rap on the knuckles with a reed stylus. If you failed to master the basics in a dozen tries, you were sent out to herd sheep. Harsh? Sure, but the temple demanded perfection, or else risked offending Nasaba, goddess of writing, who might rain down typhoid for sloppy tablets. The curriculum covered everything: arithmetic, dividing grain rations, doubling amphora counts, geometry, surveying fields after floods, and an endless parade of lexical lists, ladders of synonyms you copied until your hand muscle memory would wake. You in the dead of night, stone, pebble, rock, boulder, you drone until even the gods begged for mercy. By the time you graduated, around age 16, you could inscribe the Enuma Elish blindfolded, recite the Sumerian king list in your sleep, and calculate the correct lunar eclipse date without consulting your supervisor. Congratulations, you were finally unfit for anything but temple service, faction wars, and backroom schemes. In the scriptorium, politics ran deeper than the Euphrates. Scribes formed factions based on their patron deity or their legendary tablet of choice. There were Enlil loyalists, zealots who believed only the breath god could breathe life into words, and Inanna partisans who argued that the goddess of love and war imbued cuneiform with passion and fury. Every morning, you had to swear allegiance. By Enlil's breeze, I promise to carve only truth, or by Inanna's flame, I pledge verses of power. Slip up and you risked verbal sparring with the faction captain, a lanky scribe wielding a sharpened stylus like a rapier in one of the modest side rooms. Losers endured public readings of their mistakes while onlookers tittered behind cupped hands. Then there were the covert alliances with the palace scribes, who handled royal correspondence. Despite their silk shawls and polished bronze tools, they envied your temple position, you held godly favor, they answered only to ambitious courtiers. Occasionally, a palace messenger would slip you a tablet brimming with gossip, plots to dethrone the crown prince, secret marriages between generals and foreign princesses, whispers of a looming Assyrian invasion. If you played your cards right, patiently weaving rumors into temple records, you could curry favor with the high priest or even snag a coveted promotion. But betray his trust and you'd find your name erased from the temple roster. Your career sunk faster than a reed boat in a storm. Copy, paste, and weep. Much of a scribe's life was devoted to copying. Legal codes, medical recipes, epic poems. You transcribed them all, tablet after tablet, until cuneiform began to feel permanent in your brain. The standard assignment: 3 exact copies of any new text. One went to the temple archives, one to the governor's palace, and one to the library at Uruk, because apparently writing something once was simply too efficient. Copying took uncanny endurance. You'd settle under flickering oil lamps in a cramped back alcove, lean over your clay, and scratch out line after line. If you drifted or your stylus skidded, you scratched it out with a pointed chisel, leaving a pockmarked crater. Too many craters meant a replacement tablet, and a lecture on humility from Enheduanna, the senior scribe, who believed that suffering sharpened the intellect. Deadlines hovered like vultures. A single contracted tablet could arrive at your bench with a delivery date written in the margin. Must be dispatched in 3 days by dawn. If you missed it, the supplier withheld your barley ration for a week, leaving you weak and dizzy during stela inscriptions. Worse, chronic tardiness earned you a personal reprimand from the temple steward, who might reassign you to less prestigious work, like tallying temple privies or inscribing graffiti-style warnings about no stealing under the ziggurat steps. In other words, the scribal underworld. Rituals, holidays, and mental breakdown. Just when you thought deadlines were the worst, temple festivals arrived, weeks when your normal workload tripled. During the sacred month of Abu, you had to draft daily ritual guides, which incantations to recite while sacrificing a bull, how to arrange the reed mats for purification, and the precise position to sprinkle beer from a golden ladle. You labored through sunup to sundown, fueled only by barley cakes and the occasional gulp of date wine, while Sabatu, the temple clown, cracked jokes to keep spirits high, usually at your expense. Scribe, can you write faster than a goat can climb a ziggurat? He'd cackle and the acolytes would hoot. On the great New Year festival, Akitu, you faced your crucible. 200 tablets needed copying. Epic hymns, priestly chants, and treaties with neighboring city-states. You and your fellow scribes camped in the scriptorium, sprawling mats on the floor, snoring in between stylus clicks. If the overseer caught you dozing, you woke to a bucket of cold water dumped over your head and the command, "Record the myth of Era," a god of chaos. You scribbled verses through bleary eyes, trying not to imagine the chaos god pouring that same water over your head as revenge. Health hazards and divine retribution. Despite the high stakes of your work, the temple made little effort to protect you. Clay dust floated through the air, coating your lungs with silty grit. Ink splashes sizzled if they got on hot skin, leaving permanent scabs. If you fell ill, and scribes often did during flood season or plague outbreaks, you were sent home with a half-tablet apology. Scribe, name unwell. Absent 3 days, will resume work with fresh hands. No sick leave, no sympathy. The temple's priority was record-keeping, not your sinus infection. Worse, scribal mistakes were believed to offend Nisaba directly. If a woman's divorce decree contained a misplaced wedge that reversed shall to shall not, she could sue the temple for defamation. The high priest, furious at the scandal, demanded you perform a ritual purification, hours standing in the river, reciting 7 chapters of the Atrahasis epic, and offering a lamb at the riverbank altar. Only then could your hands be deemed clean enough to resume writing. Mentorship in the scribe's code. Amid the chaos, you needed allies, and that meant finding a mentor. The ideal guide was a senior scribe with patience and sarcasm, someone who had survived the regime of 4 high priests without losing sanity. They'd teach you shortcuts, how to press your wedge at a 30-degree angle for speed, how to mix a dryer ink by adding crushed snail shells, how to hold the stylus so your wrist didn't seize. In return, you carried their water jar, polished their reed stylus, and risked mild punishment if you spilled a drop on the sacred tablets. But the payoff was worth it. After a decade under their wing, you might receive the coveted title of Master of Tablets, complete with your own alcove in the scriptorium and a leather cushion for your backside. The price of prestige. Achieving master status was enormous, but came at a cost. With prestige came envy. Junior scribes plotted to pilfer your wax trial sheets, smudge your clay, or tip your ink pot off its stand. You learned to cloak your tools in cloth and stash your tablets under lock and key. The slightest rumor of your downfall, a falsified tablet here, an accusation of laziness there, could trigger a review by the temple council, dragging you into humiliating public debates on your competence. Retirement, such as it was, meant taking on the role of scribe emeritus, a fragile title granting you a small stipend of barley and a pension of clay tablets, useless unless you could trade them for goods. Some emeriti spent their final years tutoring novices in dank side rooms, their minds wandering back to the glory days when they carved stele for kings. Others vanished into obscurity, their stories lost like unwritten tablets buried beneath centuries of sand. Yet for all its peril, the scribal life had its highs. Imagine gazing upon a newly unveiled stele you carved, bronze letters gleaming in temple light. Picture the thrill of deciphering an Uruk letter that revealed a rare shipment of greenstone beads, luxury beyond imagination. Recall the hush that fell over an assembly when you stood to read a treaty in flawless cuneiform, the crowd leaning forward as each wedge carried divine weight. In those moments, you weren't just a pen pusher. You were a conduit between gods and mortals, a keeper of secrets, and architect of history. So now you see the true heart of the scribe's nightmare, a life of endless repetition and cosmic stakes, with rivals lurking at every clay dust corner and the threat of divine wrath in every misplaced wedge. Yet, for the dedicated, it offered a lasting legacy, etched in clay, stone, and bronze for millennia to come. As the moon climbs above the courtyard walls tonight, rest your ink-stained hand, dear scribe, for tomorrow you'll return to the Idaba, the ziggurat, and the endless whisper of clay beneath stylus. The gods await your script. As the sun rises over the ziggurat's highest terraces for what feels like the 1000th time, you steel yourself for the final stretch of your scribal career. Today is not about tax tablets or royal decrees. No, today you tackle the culmination of everything you've learned, compiling the temple catalog of deities, an encyclopedic tome listing the names, epithets, and ritual protocols for every god, goddess, and minor spirit ever honored within these mud brick walls. In short, the mother of all projects, and the one that will define your legacy. You break your fast on a handful of date cakes and a sip of coarse beer, then stride into the scriptorium where half a dozen junior scribes stare at you with envy and dread. Their assignment: gather all existing clay tablets related to temple devotion, prayer formulas, hymn fragments, offering inventories, and deliver them to your bench. They shuffle off, clutching dusty tablets like contraband. You arrange them in neat piles, one for Inanna's rites, one for Enlil's wind invocations, one for Ninkasi's brewing blessings, and so on. A tall stack labeled minor spirits and demons looms ominously to your right, an unholy muddle of half-remembered names and conflicting rituals. Your tool of choice is a fresh stylus, its reed sharpened to a perfect point. You've mixed your ink extra thick today, adding a dash of crushed snail shells to slow its flow and heighten your control. You begin with the major deities: Anu, Father of Heaven; Enlil, Lord of Wind and Kingmaker; Enki, the wise god of water and crafts. For each you record their epithets: Bull of Heaven, Lord of the lofty mountain, their principal temple location, their favorite offerings, and the exact phrasing of the invocation that ensures their favor. You copy each entry once in standard registry clay, and once on a small limestone stela for presentation in the inner sanctum. Hours pass unnoticed as you carve wedge after wedge. By midday, your hand aches, but the catalog demands completeness. You move on to lesser gods: Nasaba, the grain goddess; Utu, the sun judge; Namtar, the bringer of fates. Their rituals are trickier. Some require pouring oil in precise patterns. Others mandate the slitting of a black lamb's throat at dawn. One obscure grain spirit demands that its worshippers recite a 4-line hymn while standing in a circle of barley stalks. You raise an eyebrow, head tilted as if to ask, who on earth discovered this? But you dutifully record it, a historian trapped in a conspiracy of cuneiform. Late afternoon, your supervising acolyte brings news. The high priest has scheduled a private audience at dusk. He wishes to review the catalog's introduction, the framing text that will be read aloud during the consecration ceremony. You set aside your clay tablets and knead your stylus in hand, knowing the introduction must strike a delicate balance between humility before the gods and pride in the temple's standing. You retire to a side alcove to compose the text. By the grace of Anu and Enlil, this catalog stands as testament to the myriad voices that shape our world. May every name inscribed herein echo in the heavens, and may our offerings honor the divine in all its forms. You draft it twice before the acolyte nods approval. At dusk, the high priest awaits you in his private chamber, flickering oil lamps casting long shadows on carved wooden doors. He unrolls a fresh tablet and reads your words aloud in a low, resonant voice. Line by line, he tests their weight and balance. At one point, he pauses and asks if you can invoke a phrase from an earlier hymnal, an arcane allusion to an ancient ritual meant to bind curses. You bow, realize you memorized it years ago, and add the line seamlessly. Let those who break oaths feel the cold breath of Nergal on their necks. The high priest smiles, tapping his finger. Perfect. As a reward, he grants you a rare favor, a week's respite from your regular duties to complete the catalog. That night, alone under a single oil lamp, you survey the piles of tablets around you. You've recorded over 200 deities so far, but dozens remain: garden spirits, river nymphs, even the odd profession-based deity like the forager of cattle. You dip your stylus and press on, determined to finish by week's end. Your neck stiffens, your eyes burn, and the seal of your inkpot becomes a bright white glare. Yet the knowledge that future priests, kings, and scholars will consult your work keeps you going. On the third night, you reach the final category: household gods and personal guardian spirits. These are small beings with big personalities, protectors of doorways, overseers of dreams, or wardens against witchcraft. One requires a single grain of incense offered every full moon. Another demands that its name never be spoken in public. Recording their details is like cataloging the whispering ghosts of 1,000 homes. You work past midnight, translating oral traditions into permanent record. At dawn on the 7th day, by flickering torchlight, you place the last tablet in the kiln. Exhausted but triumphant, you allow yourself a moment's pride. The catalog of deities is complete, a monumental achievement few scribes ever undertake. It stands not only as a temple instrument, but as a beacon of knowledge that may one day outlast the very stones of the ziggurat. Tomorrow, the high priest will preside over the consecration. Priests will chant, victims will be offered, and you, hunched over tablets and stone, will oversee the distribution of the finished catalog, rolling it out for all to see. You will watch as nobles nod in approval, as farmers trace the names of their household spirits, and as the high priest lifts the limestone stela, displaying your immortal words to the heavens. And then, after the ceremonial fanfare, you will return to clay tablets and ink pots. New tax records will appear, fresh decrees will demand inscription, and the cycle of wedges will begin anew. But for one shining moment, you will stand at the pinnacle of your craft, a master whose hand guided the voice of the divine for generations to come. As you finally lay your stylus aside, your body sore and your spirit exhilarated, you realize the paradox of your life. A quiet, unseen labor that nonetheless shapes destinies, mediates gods, and cements history. The sun climbs once more over the city, and you, scribe of the temple, prepare to greet it with fresh clay in hand and an unbreakable resolve to record the world, one wedge at a time. Imagine wandering through an endless forest with nothing but a twig for dinner, dodging saber-toothed cats on your morning commute, and sleeping on a bed of rocks while swatting prehistoric mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds. Welcome to the glamorous life of a Paleolithic gatherer, where starving is just your daily cardio, and food safety means praying harder than a weekend warrior at a juice cleanse seminar. You wake just before sunrise, your back aching from sleeping on a slab of granite someone once mistook for a comfortable pillow. There's no ringing alarm clock here, only the low grumble of your empty stomach and the distant howl of something large and toothy hunting dinner. You sit up, stretch your arms, and realize you've spent the past 12 hours wrapped in nothing but animal hide and your own paranoia. Your morning routine begins with reconnaissance. Before you can even think about breakfast, you must scout for edible plants, tubers, berries, nuts, and, if you're daring, mushrooms. The problem is, half of what looks tasty is either poisonous enough to kill you in minutes, or hallucinogenic enough to have you convinced a woolly mammoth is your spirit animal. You reach down, pick a leaf, and rub it between your fingers, hoping your gut doesn't revolt at the sight of sap or spines. You nibble a tiny bit. Boom! Your tongue feels like it's on fire, and you spend the next hour drooling and convinced you'll turn into a toad. If you survive that, you move on to the tubers. You kneel in swampy dirt and claw at the ground with your bare hands because someone forgot to bring a spade. Or rather, spades hadn't been invented. When you finally unearth a knobbly root, you examine it for signs of rot holes, or angry grubs. Slice it open against a sharp stone and sip the liquid. If it's bitter or milky, you drop it immediately and pray it's not the kind that slowly kills your kidneys over several agonizing days. Assuming you've scrounged a few edible morsels, you stuff them into your woven grass basket, a flimsy contraption likely to tear any second, and head deeper into the forest. Now comes the real fun, scavenging nuts and seeds. You can ignore the toxic ones, like acorns, which require hours of leaching to remove tannins, but only if you recognize them. In the Gathering Guild, which you definitely didn't apply for, misidentifying a nut could give you severe gastrointestinal fireworks or neurological damage. Still, you pluck half-ripe nuts, knock them from branches, and listen for the hollow sound that means they're mature. But sometimes they're full of maggots, and you spend 10 minutes cracking each one only to find your prize infested. Time is your enemy. If you dawdle, shadowy predators are already tracking your scent. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant hyenas, all of them specialists at turning a lone forager into lunch. You carry nothing more than a sharpened flint knife, an upgrade from your bare hands but still barely better than a credit card-sized shard, and maybe a pointed stick wound with sinew to fling at small game. But most animals outrun you, burrow too deep, or taste so foul that you'd rather wait for berries that might kill you. By midday, you filled your basket to the brim with a smorgasbord of half-poisonous delicacies, and you realize it's time to head home before dusk. Except you have no map, no trail markers, and every tree looks exactly the same after you've spent 6 hours crouching under them. You remember a mossy rock near a twisted oak, if only you could find it. You wander in widening circles, the sun slipping lower, and your heart pounds every time a twig snaps behind you. Eventually, panic sets in. You consider climbing a tree to get your bearings, but prehistoric trees give you splinters, and climbing exposes you to swooping raptors. Just when you think you're doomed to wander the forest until starvation or predators claim you, you spot smoke on the horizon, your clan's campfire. But how did it get that high? You shout, wave your basket like a flag, and nearly tumble off a moss-covered boulder in your excitement. You stumble forward, bruised and bloodied, hauling your basket of dubious forage. As you approach, you see your fellow gatherers staring at you with pity and mild amusement. You've returned with enough scraps to feed a toddler's dollhouse. Meanwhile, the hunters have dragged in a half-grown deer, strung up by its antlers, and are already carving steaks. You drop your basket, red-faced, as a neighbor hefts a perfectly charred cut of meat on a spit and teases, "Nice haul, Daisy. Did the berries fight back?" You force a laugh and pretend you are gathering poisonous fun facts, because admitting you came home empty-handed would mean being on dinner detail tonight, scraping the campfire of burnt roots and chewing on gristly fat. They couldn't be bothered to boil. Your afternoon is spent processing whatever you collected. You sort edible from poisonous, rinse dirt off tubers in the nearest stream, hoping the water isn't full of parasites that turn your insides into a horror show, and roast nuts in the embers. Berries go into a hollowed-out gourd for storage, but only if they're not the poisonous kind that could induce paralysis. You chew, swallow, and cross your fingers, praying you don't end up comatose in the bushes while saber-toothed cats sniff you out. Between bites, you reflect on your tribe's unspoken hierarchy. The best seats at communal fires go to hunters who risk real danger and bring home high-protein meals. Gatherers occupy the bottom rungs. You collect carbs and fats no one else wants to track down. It's brutal, but someone has to scour the land for supplemental nutrition. At least you won't starve alone, unless the hunters decide to ration meat and your share gets slashed to roots and berries. As evening descends, you squat by the fire, muscles sore from digging and shoulders aching from carrying baskets. You listen to the wind whistle through the pines, a sound that could easily become the growl of a predator. You tuck your knife under your belt, tighten your grass cloak against the night chill, and try to sleep on the cold ground. Dreams of giant woolly rhinos trampling your basket wake you every hour, and by dawn you feel more exhausted than when you started. But this is your life, dawn to dusk, scavenging through a minefield of poisonous plants, predatory beasts, and endless uncertainty. There's no safety net, no grocery store, and certainly no Uber Eats. Your dinner depends on your knowledge of botany, your speed in flight, and your luck not to pick the wrong mushroom. Each day ends with a gamble, feast, famine, or predator brunch. End of part 1. Next time, we'll dive into the real hazards of weather, tribal politics, and the bizarre rituals hunters perform to avoid getting eaten themselves. Spoiler: snowstorms and thunderstorms are less about romance and more about hypothermia and lightning-shaped holes in your hide. Ready for part 2? And just like that, you're back in the unglamorous world of prehistoric foraging, where the real threats don't come from giant beasts but from the weather, tribal drama, and rituals so absurd they'd make reality TV blush. First, the weather. In your world, every sunrise could herald a blissful spring day or the onset of a storm that rips tents from the ground and turns paths into rivers of mud. Rain isn't gentle. It's a gale that drenches you in minutes, soaks your grass cloak, and makes your wooden basket sag under the weight of waterlogged tubers. The fire you spent half a day coaxing to life sputters out, leaving you shivering with hypothermia inching up your spine. You huddle under giant leaves or take refuge in rock overhangs, but leaky caves fill with dank wind and the occasional bat. Lightning doesn't just light up the sky, it smacks trees around you, hurling burning branches like prehistoric flamethrowers. When hailstones descend the size of walnuts, you scramble for cover, ears ringing like a trapped deer, cursing your decision to wear zero head protection. And if a blizzard strikes, you're buried in snow, fingers numb, vision disappearing, wondering whether you'll freeze waiting for the seasons to change or end up as a snack for a passing wolf pack. Next, tribal politics. Your clan isn't a happy communal commune, it's a cutthroat hierarchy where every scrap of food doubles as currency. Gatherers like you are perpetually bottom-ranked. No matter how many wild onions you deliver, hunters still lord their kills over you. You whisper complaints to your fellow gatherers around the fire, plotting to snub the hunters by hiding mushrooms or squirreling away berries for yourselves. But word gets around, and the hunters retaliate by hoarding meat, dancing around the fire with victory chants that leave you gnawing on raw roots in silent fury. If you speak up too loudly, the alpha hunter might accuse you of witchcraft, because nothing says ungrateful gatherer like suggesting anyone would dare question the divine right of a guy who once speared a rabbit. A public warning ritual follows. You're forced to eat a bitter bark concoction and stand barefoot in cold water for an hour while the tribe chants, honor the catch, until your toes go numb. Tribal life is glorious. Then there are the bizarre rituals of self-preservation. The hunters, paranoid about angering animal spirits, bind themselves in animal skins 3 days before a big hunt, chanting incantations to coax game into their spears. You, on the gatherer side, concoct your own crazy superstitions, wearing a wreath of fern leaves to ward off deer attacks, smearing mud and spiral patterns on your face to confuse saber-toothed cats, and carrying around lucky stones carved with stick figures. During the Great Nut Festival, the one time a year when everyone lays down weapons to gnaw nuts in peace, tribal elders bury a live tortoise at the forest's edge to coax the nut spirits into dropping more almonds. You arrive hopeful, watch them dig, bury the tortoise, and pray, then wander off to find exactly 0 nuts because the magic turned out to be random bird migrations. Midday heat brings another hazard, sunstroke. Without shade, you fry under the sky, your brain pulsing inside your skull, your vision dotted with stars. You stumble to whatever water you can find, often a stagnant swamp, and dunk your head, emerging with hair full of algae and water fleas. You pound your chest like a frantic ape, hoping to revive your senses, then lean against a tree and curse your ancestors for not inventing hats. Insects are no joke either. Mosquitoes buzz like miniature pterodactyls, drilling holes in your skin that swell into fiery welts. Ticks bury into your scalp, pumping your blood full of bacteria that turn you into a fevered mess. Flies land on every speck of uncovered flesh, buzzing in your ear, spreading disease with every unwanted landing. You swat, squish, and rub mud on your skin, an ancient sunblock and insect repellent until the mud dries, cracks, and flakes off into your food, leaving you eating dirt. As evening falls, exhaustion sets in and sleep eludes you. The ground is cold or covered in thorny plants that jab your shoulders. You dream of soft grass and comfy beds. That is, if you're lucky enough not to dream of giant cave bears sniffing your basket. You wake at every crack or distant roar, muscle locked and heart hammering, unable to tell a falling branch from a predator's approach. The constant stress grinds at your sanity. You form close bonds with fellow gatherers who share your misery, trading tips on which berries actually kill you, and swapping war stories about empty-handed returns. But even camaraderie has a limit. Food rationed to keep the clan alive means grudges build over spilled milk kelp or the last edible tuber. You overhear scheming. Some want to replace the foragers with a flint tool that can dig deeper, or a new hunter who also gathers. Rumors swirl that the biggest root patch is guarded by a sacred snake spirit. Whichever fool chases a phantom snake ends up sacrificing his last serving of yams to the ritual, then eating bitter yams as penance. Meanwhile, the odd medicine man wanders through the woods, muttering about balancing humors and evil winds. He slaps a poultice on your leg that smells like burnt hair and insists you dance around a fire at midnight, waving a carved bone and chanting nonsense syllables. You oblige, terrified of curses, but end up spraining your ankle on a hidden root. He pronounces you blessed anyway, pockets your last handful of dried berries, and moves on, leaving you hopping on one foot until tribesmen pity you and toss you scraps of boiled insect grubs. Worst of all is the knowledge that this madness never ends. You dream of terraform, that future time when people invent farms, markets, and restaurants. But in your reality, every day is another fresh round of life or death foraging. You mask your despair with sarcastic laughter. "Oh great, more blackberry vines," you mutter as you hack through brambles, spraying your face with thorns. Just what I needed, more bleeding for dinner. Yet in this savage realm, you learn resilience. You master the art of spotting edible plants by their leaf veins, cracking nuts with precise rock angles, and reading the sky for weather patterns. You develop a sixth sense for predator tracks, twig breaks, and the faint stink of rot that tells you where a carcass might lie, and vultures gather. You trade bits of knowledge with hunters, like how to use stones to harden spear tips or which mushrooms can sober you up from a trip gone wrong. Sometimes they return the favor by teaching you simple bone carvings, tiny toggles to repair your basket, or mini hooks to snare fish from shallow streams. And when at last you collapse beside the dying embers of the campfire, surrounded by scarred trees and the moans of night creatures, you realize your life is a brutal apprenticeship in survival. Every wound, every blister, every bitter berry teaches you something. You may never find the fabled fruit trees of legend, but you'll keep scavenging, adapting, and, if you're lucky, finding just enough calories to greet the next dawn. After all, there's a grim satisfaction in knowing that despite all the storms, snakes, social scheming, and elemental fury, you're still here, still breathing, still sarcastically cursing the gods of the underbrush as you wait for your turn at the communal fire. End of part 2. Ready to delve into part 3's lessons on stone tools, hidden water caches, and why cooking over lava flows remains a terrible idea. Welcome back to the Forager's Boot Camp, where your ancestors pitched survival as a never-ending obstacle course, and food security meant not getting eaten or poisoned before you starved. In part 3, you'll master the prehistoric toolkit, discover the hidden water caches that could save or doom you, learn why lava flows are the worst kitchen ever, and see how the Forager's social network oscillates between tribal broadband and total radio silence. Ready? Let's dive into the wilderness once more, twig spear in hand, basket over shoulder, terror in heart. Your first stop, the Stone Age hardware store. When magma cools and hardens, it occasionally gives you glorious slabs of obsidian, volcanic glass sharper than any metal to come. You grin as you heft a napped blade, its edge gleaming like demon silver. With this tool, you can peel bark, scrape sinew, and butcher small game in minutes rather than hours. But the obsidian comes with a catch, brittle edges that chip if you so much as sneeze on them. One bad drop and you're back to flint shards that barely shave hair, let alone carve tubers free of dirt. Your spare blades live in a leather pouch, alongside precautions, wrapping them in grass so they don't slice your own entrails in the night. Next, the digging stick. A stout branch hardened in the fire, one end carved to a crude point. You trudge into sedge meadows and plunge the stick into the earth, leveraging your weight to crack open soil packed from years of trampling. You soon learn that some roots require elbow grease that your spindly arms simply can't muster. Your contemporaries have magically longer arms, or so you suspect, as they unearth giant yams where you find only twigs. After a dozen failed attempts and scraped knuckles, you appreciate that tool making is an art. The right angle, the perfect smoldering and embers to toughen the wood, and a rhythm that soon turns the chore into a dance. One you still inevitably trip over. Now, water, the elixir that kills almost as often as it saves. Prehistoric rivers are laced with parasites, sediment, and the occasional crocodile. You learn to seek hidden water caches, deep holes in riverbanks where groundwater seeps in, cooler and clearer than the surface flow. Finding these oases requires reading subtle clues. Lush patches of reeds, a swoop of dragonflies, or the call of thirsty birds at dawn. You dig with your stick, let the mire drain, then filter with grass or sand. If you're sloppy, you get diarrhea so violent that saber-toothed cats can smell weakness in the air. If you're lucky, you coax just enough water to wash a handful of roots without ending up delirious and face down in a puddle. Speaking of puddles, rainwater collection becomes a midday project. You carve shallow basins in rock or hollow out large leaves, then dash out at the first drizzle, hoping to catch even a few precious drops. It's a mad scramble when a storm brews. Villagers abandon baskets, shriek in fear of lightning, and chase clouds like deranged cliff jumpers. The payoff? Enough water to boil a starchy pulp, boiling because learning how to harness fire for cooking was perhaps humanity's greatest invention. Except for when you accidentally overheat a stone pot near a lava flow. Yes, lava. Living in volcanic regions gives you obsidian, hot springs, and the occasional terrifying BBQ from hell. You spot a bubbling fissure, think, great heat source for cooking, and set a stone slab above the channel. You adjust your sticks, place roots on the slab, and then oh my god lava spatters send you careening backward, your face roasting from rising heat. Lesson learned. Volcanic grills are nice, but your ancestors preferred wood fire pits, where at least the embers behave themselves. Between toolcraft and water foraging, the day slips away, and you gather what you can. Dried insects from rock crevices, protein if you can stomach the crunch, grubs unearthed from rotting logs, surprisingly sweet if fresh, and resin from pine. Trees, chewable gum that doubles as antiseptic. Each morsel comes with its own risks. Swallowed alive, the grubs can burrow in your stomach. Pine resin, laced with toxins, leaves you cross-eyed and hallucinating about mammoth ballet recitals. You learn to sample small, spit out shockers, and share wisdom in drawn-out taste test sessions with your gathering crew. But even the best tool in water strategy flounders if you can't navigate. Without maps or compasses, you use solar shadows, moss-covered boulders, and bird flight patterns to orient yourself. If a bird, mind you, a sane bird, takes straight flight from a nearby cliff at sunrise, you know the sea might be east, which means fish dinner tonight if you can find a tide pool. If birds circle perpetually, you're near a carcass, great for scavenging, terrible for stench and predator encounters. One misread sign and you're 40 kilometers off course, singing your death ballad to an audience of mosquitoes. Meanwhile, the social side of gathering emerges. No tribe is an island. Your band sizes swell or shrink with the availability of resources. When wild honey flows, the news spreads like wildfire. You muster every gatherer within shouting range, form human chains to raid beehives, and then fight over sticky spoils. When the winter chill sets in, numbers dwindle. Some drift to better lands, leaving you to lick frostbite and gnaw at your own mittens. Group size dictates safety. Small parties dodge predators more quietly but lack manpower for heavy tasks. Large parties boast security but deplete resources faster. Finding the sweet spot feels like social Jenga. One wrong move and the camp collapses into chaos. Within these social networks, gossip is as precious as food. You learn about fruiting seasons in far-off valleys, secret springs beyond the mountain pass, and rumor of a new obsidian vein just over the ridge. You share intel at camps. Over smoky fires, you trade locations like traders swapping salt. And each tidbit can mean the difference between a feast and a famine. But beware, too much boasting brands you a target. Other gatherers may ambush your trail and steal your find, leaving you hollering at shadows while they thumb their noses and munch on your prize nut harvest. As dusk nears, you return to camp with whatever you've scavenged, greet the hunters nursing their kills, and stand awkwardly by the embers. You offer your haul, tiny sacks of grubs, half-rotten berries, a petrified bee comb, and they nod politely before passing the venison across. You trade your supplement for scraps of meat, marveling that your worthless berries got you a half-smoked rib. This is bartering in its rawest form. You hand over slight sustenance to receive high-value protein and the smug prestige of being part of the clan's food chain. But the day's not over until you've processed your forage. You stomp and sift through roots, crush berries for dye, a secondary income for apparel decoration, and smoke dry your nuts by the fire so they'll last through the next rain. You whittle stone needles to sew skins into warmer garments for winter, using bark fiber thread harvested weeks earlier. By the time your fingers go numb and you give up, you've extended your bounty's shelf life by a handful of days, just enough to survive until the next resource miracle. As night falls, you join the circle around the fire. Ritual time. Gatherers have their own rites, anointing your skin with fatty animal grease to repel insects and any errant spirits, chanting to the great Earth Mother for a bountiful spring, and passing around a communal torch symbolizing the hunt's eternal flame. You wave a torch overhead, feel the smoke sting your eyes, and mimic the hunter's war dance, though your stick spear and basket feel ill-fitting compared to a sharpened haft. Afterward, you share tips in hushed tones, where to find the sweetest roots, how to coax water from moss lumps, and which scorpions pack edible brood sacks if you're desperate enough. Finally, you curl up on the cold ground, belt your blade beside you, and tuck your heads under thick furs. You pray to the stars that tonight's predators sleep in, that tomorrow's berries aren't toxic, and that the sun returns with mercy. As you drift into a fitful doze, you know that despite all the dangers, you've expanded your survival IQ. Your stomach killed or fed you today, your tools kept you busy, and your clan gave you enough scraps to last until dawn. Rest up, because in part 4, we'll tackle the ultimate gatherer's challenge, seasonal migration, how you pack up months of meager supplies, navigate inhospitable terrain, and stake your life on the hope that the grasslands on the horizon actually have more edible goodies waiting. Spoiler, they rarely do. Welcome back, bold foragers, to the grand finale of why you wouldn't survive as a prehistoric gatherer. If you thought dodging saber-toothed cats and sifting for edible grubs was tough, wait until you attempt seasonal migration, packing up your entire camp, expelling months of emotional baggage, and gambling your life on rumors of greener pastures. Spoiler alert, they're rarely greener and often full of worse berries. Dawn breaks on the final day of abundance in your home valley. The nuts are nearly gone, berry bushes have been stripped bare, and the final honeycombs have been harvested until the bees moved on or died. The hunters pack their spears with fresh points. You haul your remaining toolkit, a dozen obsidian blades, worn digging sticks, sinew-wrapped baskets. Each gatherer bundles up root caches wrapped in grass mats, shelling out the last of your starch reserves so you might eat on the trail. You shoulder your burdens, swallow a hitching sob, and join the migration column as it snakes through the morning mist. First order of business, navigation. You've received rumors of a fertile basin 2 weeks' walk east, river-fed meadows carpeted with edible tubers and wild grains. The only problem, nobody has been there in living memory, and your map consists of a handful of sketch notches on a cedar bark strip. Still, hope springs eternal, so you follow the elders through pine forests, over rocky ridges, and across streams that chill your bones. Every step, you wonder whether the rumor was a desperate wish or a cruel joke. Day 1 brings a taste of freedom, fresh mountain air, distant views of snow-capped peaks, the scent of untouched flora. You dart off the trail to sample moss-growing lichens and scoop snails from wet rocks. Your basket creaks in excitement. That night, you pitch camp by a crystal brook, so clear you swear you see fish dart by. You fashion a crude fish hook from bone, snag a small trout, roast it on embers, and savor your first real protein in days. Victory is sweet, until you realize all the trout are downstream, too many to catch, and the riverbank is infested with leashes that latch onto your ankles at dusk. You wrestle them off, stomp melodramatic war dances in the mud, and vow to stick to roots next time. On day 3, the trail narrows into a rocky pass. One misstep sends you sliding toward a sheer drop. You freeze, heart pounding, clutch your spear for balance, and curse your ancestors for not inventing railings. Nearby, your fellow gatherers slip on scree and curse back. Minor injuries mount, sprained ankles, skinned knees, a rogue boulder nicking a thigh. The healers apply poultices of crushed herbs and singe the wounds with hot coals, an ancient cauterization that seals flesh, but not your rage at this torturous scenic route. By day 5, the vegetation changes. Pine gives way to oak and sycamore. You spy promising patches of acorns that must be processed to remove tannins, countless blackberries and fat earthworms wriggling in loamy soil. You sink to your knees, devour roots like a rock star at a buffet, and refill your baskets. Spirits lift until a thunderstorm strikes. You dash under a lone wind-scarred tree, arms outstretched to catch water, only to have lightning knock the tree nearby with a deafening crack. Mudslides roar down the slopes, sweeping away some of your bundles and forcing a chaotic scramble. You curse climate gods, shove soggy roots into your mouth, and keep moving through the deluge. By day 8, the column reaches a high meadow rumored to produce wild barley. You find only stunted grass and poisonous nightshade. Frustration mounts. Debates break out. Should you press on toward the legend of the Four Rivers Lake, or turn back to a different valley you once passed? The elders shout over each other. Hunters jab at foragers for whining. Children cry from hunger. You stand at a crossroads of despair, realizing that leadership in a nomadic band is a thankless misery. Everyone wants to follow you when you find food, and blame you when you don't. Eventually, consensus settles on pushing forward. Day 10 brings a reward, a hidden grove of young hazelnuts still sweet and plentiful. You crack them open with a rock, sample them greedily, then shell a dozen baskets worth for the clan. It feels like triumph, until you notice the trees grow only in a narrow strip. The next grove is days away. Over-harvesting here risked leaving nothing for return migration. You ration your haul, stash secret caches marked by subtle stackings of stones, and warn the younger gatherers not to betray the spot. Night 12 turns cold. You camp on a barren ridge, shivering through the hours. Flames in the communal fire barely stave off hypothermia. You wrap in animal skins, lean against each other for heat, and try to sleep with arms draped around your basket so no one steals your precious nuts. Dreams of tropical beaches invade, until you shudder awake, remembering no palms exist in these latitudes. Finally, on day 15, the legendary basin appears. A broad valley rimmed by cliffs, river braids spreading like a fan, and green marshes teeming with lotus roots. It's everything the rumors promised. You race ahead, trample reeds, and fill baskets with stubby tubers that taste like damp cotton, undeniably edible, but about as nutritious as wet paper. You sample aquatic grasses, sea duck eggs, and clumps of algae that brush off your fingers in slimy strings. Protein comes from scavenged freshwater mussels, if you can open their shells with your flint knife, and the occasional fish you stun with sap-tipped arrows. It's a feast contrasted by tedium. Hours spent gathering tiny bits for minimal calories, followed by hours cleaning silt from your harvest. Meanwhile, the hunters track marsh deer and wild boar drawn to the water, but every kill takes hours of tracking through quaking bogs that swallow boots and dignity. You hear distant trumpeting of mastodon herds once thought extinct here, but they never approach. You dig shallow pits to trap small game, only to have water flood them. You wear out your tools, then resort to hand-foraging rice grasses that sting your palms. The valley is beautiful, a postcard of prehistory, but beauty doesn't put food on the table. After another week, the column divides. Some hunters push into the cliff's caves to ambush goats. Others return east to the acorn groves. Gatherers like you must decide, stay in the marsh and risk waterborne diseases, or trek back through treacherous passes to the safety of known foraging grounds. You volunteer to head home, because familiarity, minuscule though its rewards may be, beats the unknown. You load your baskets with a mix of tubers and hazelnuts, bid farewell to the basin's silent expanse, and plot your return through the scree, the storms, and the snake-infested ravines. Back on day 23, you stagger into your original valley. The trees look oddly friendly now. You exchange precious tubers for chipped obsidian points from returning huntsmen. You laugh at the absurdity of migration. You left to find hope, endured near death, but returned with scraps that cost more in blisters than their worth. The elders shake heads, children celebrate the homecoming, and you collapse by the fire, basket at your feet, finally sated by the familiarity of thin root soup. As you sit in the flickering glow, chewing through another last season tuber, you reflect on the migratory lesson. Life on the move demands more than courage and curiosity. It demands near automatic maps, social cohesion, and miracle providence. Without domesticated crops, you trade exhaustion for slim chance of bounty. The horizon always beckons, but the promise of abundance is fickle, and every journey risks turning your clan into ghosts in the wilderness. So here we are, dear viewers. 4 brutal chapters of prehistoric gathering life. Twigs for dinner, fungal roulette, tribal power plays, tool crafting, hideous migrations, and the constant gamble between feast and famine. If you ever think modern life is tough, remember, at least your grocery store has a roof. Checkout lines are mercifully blood-free, and you don't need to rub mud on your skin to keep the bugs guessing. Thank you for joining this sarcastic, savage dive into the ultimate survival nightmare. Hit that like button if you're glad you weren't born then. Subscribe for more dark history deep dives, and drop a comment. Which part mortified you most? And where on earth would you actually want to gather your dinner? Until next time, stay safe, stay modern, and let's keep our roots strictly metaphorical.